Welcome, fellow dreamer. This evening, we're going to explore the extraordinary journey of music itself, from the earliest bone flutes carved by ancient hands to the grand symphonies that fill concert halls and the electronic sounds that shape our modern world. We'll discover how different cultures found their own voices through instruments, and why certain melodies and harmonies have the power to stir something deep within us. Accompanied by soothing music and abstract imagery, we'll be uncovering little-known wonders and fascinating stories that gently feed your curiosity as you drift towards sleep. And now take a deep breath, let your body sink into comfort, and allow your mind to rest and your eyes to close as the tale unfolds before you. The cave is silent now, but 40,000 years ago, it held a sound that had never existed before. Deep in what we now call the Swabian Jura of southern Germany, a person sat with a piece of bone in their hands. Perhaps firelight flickered against the limestone walls. Perhaps others gathered nearby, curious about what their companion was making. The bone was from a vulture, hollow and light, and someone had spent hours carefully drilling holes along its length with stone tools, working with patience and precision that speaks across the millennia. When that ancient craftsperson first blew across the opening of their creation, music, as we understand it, was born. The sound would have been breathy and clear, a tone that rose above the ambient sounds of wind and water that had filled the world until then. This wasn't the crack of stone on stone, the rustle of leaves, or even the rhythm of footsteps. This was something new, something intentional, something beautiful. We know about this moment because that flute survived. Archaeologists discovered it in Hohlfels Cave in 2008, along with fragments of other similar instruments. When researchers carefully measured the finger holes and created replicas, they found that these weren't random perforations. The spacing was deliberate, designed to produce different pitches when different combinations of holes were covered. Someone 40,000 years ago understood that controlling the length of a vibrating column of air would change the sound it produced. They couldn't have explained it in terms of physics or frequency, but they knew it in their hands and heard it with their ears. These bone flutes represent the oldest confirmed musical instruments in archaeological evidence, but they almost certainly weren't the first. Long before anyone thought to shape a flute, our ancestors were making music with the instruments they carried with them always, their voices and their bodies. The rhythmic pattern of walking creates a steady beat. Hands clapping together produce a sharp, satisfying sound. The human voice can hum, sing, shout, and whisper across a remarkable range of pitches and volumes. Imagine the daily life of early humans tens of thousands of years before those bone flutes. Groups worked together, gathering plants, tracking animals, processing hides, shaping tools. Many of these activities involved repetitive motions, and repetitive motions naturally fall into rhythm. When multiple people work together, coordinating those rhythms makes the work more efficient. Anyone who has heard sailors singing work songs or listened to the call and response of people rowing together understands this ancient truth. Rhythm helps us synchronize, and synchronization makes us stronger. Vocalizations likely began as communication, warnings and calls across distance, but the human voice can do so much more than convey simple information. We can change our pitch smoothly, sliding from low sounds to high ones and back again. We can sustain notes, holding a single tone while others create different tones around us. When two people sing different notes simultaneously, they create harmony, and certain combinations of pitches sound particularly pleasing to human ears. Our ancestors discovered this not through theory, but through experience, probably long before anyone thought to create an instrument from bone or wood. The natural world around our ancestors was filled with sounds that might have served as inspiration. Birds produced elaborate songs, each species with its own characteristic patterns. Wind moving through hollow reeds created whistling tones. Striking hollow logs with sticks produced resonant thuds that carried across distances. Thunder rumbled in deep, powerful waves. The world was already musical. Humans simply learned to participate in that music more intentionally. We can only speculate about why someone first decided to create a flute, to invest the hours of careful work required to drill precise holes in fragile bone. Perhaps they wanted to imitate bird songs. Perhaps they discovered accidentally that blowing across a hollow tube created an interesting sound, and then experimented with ways to change that sound. Perhaps music making had already become important enough to their culture that creating specialized instruments made sense. What we do know is that by the time those Swabian flutes were created, music was already sophisticated enough that people valued it sufficiently to spend precious time and effort on instrument making. The flutes from Hole Fell's cave aren't crude first attempts. They're refined instruments, suggesting a long tradition of musical experimentation that came before them. Other early instruments have been found across the world, though none quite as old as the German bone flutes. In China, flutes made from the wing bones of red-crowned cranes date back 9,000 years. In what is now Egypt, clappers and rattles appear in archaeological sites from 7,000 years ago. Drums, which leave little archaeological trace because their materials decay, were almost certainly among the earliest instruments, requiring only stretched hide and a hollow vessel. The human relationship with rhythm is fundamental and perhaps even biological. Our hearts beat in steady rhythms, we breathe in patterns. Even before birth, we hear the constant pulse of our mother's heartbeat. Rhythm is built into our experience of being alive, and creating rhythmic music might be an extension of recognizing and celebrating those internal patterns. Melody, the progression of different pitches over time, seems to connect to the natural patterns of human speech. When we talk, our voices rise and fall, creating what linguists call prosody. The same sentence can mean different things depending on whether our voice goes up or down at the end. Anger, joy, sadness, and curiosity all have characteristic melodic patterns in speech. Perhaps music grew from an elaboration of these emotional vocal patterns, taking the natural rise and fall of expressive speech and extending it, sustaining it, organizing it into something more formal. As the firelight dimmed in that German cave 40,000 years ago, and the person with the bone flute perhaps played a simple melody, they were doing something profoundly human. They were taking the raw materials of the world and shaping them into organized sound. They were creating beauty that served no immediate survival purpose, that wouldn't feed them or shelter them, but that enriched their existence in ways that made them more fully human. Music didn't develop in isolation in one place and spread. Instead, every human culture we know about has created music. From the Arctic to the tropics, from tiny islands to vast continents, wherever humans have lived, they have sung and created instruments and organized sound into patterns. This universality suggests that music answers some deep human need, something woven into who we are as a species. From these earliest beginnings, from the first intentional flutes and the songs that surely preceded them, music would grow and diversify. Different cultures would develop their own instruments, their own scales and systems, their own theories about what made sounds pleasing. Yet all of it traces back to those fundamental discoveries, that humans could create organized sound, that certain sounds pleased the ear more than others, and that making music together created bonds and expressed emotions in ways that words alone could not. As humanity moved beyond its earliest musical explorations, spreading across continents and establishing permanent settlements, something remarkable began to happen. Different civilizations, separated by vast distances and having no contact with one another, independently arrived at similar conclusions about how to organize sound. Between 3,000 and 1,000 years before the Common Era, the great river valleys of the ancient world became cradles not just of agriculture and writing, but of sophisticated musical traditions. In the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Sumerians and their successors developed instruments that would echo through millennia. Archaeological excavations at the Royal Cemetery of Ur, carefully conducted in the 1920s, revealed lyres that had rested in the earth for more than 4,000 years. These were not simple instruments. They featured elaborately decorated sound boxes, often topped with golden bull heads whose eyes were inlaid with lapis lazuli and shell. The strings, which have long since decayed, once stretched across a wooden crossbar, their tension carefully adjusted to produce specific pitches. Clay tablets from this same civilization preserve what may be the world's oldest written music, hymns inscribed in cuneiform script that scholars have painstakingly attempted to reconstruct and perform in our modern era. The Mesopotamian musicians played for temples and palaces, their music woven into the fabric of religious ceremony and royal celebration. They had names for different modes and tuning systems, suggesting a theoretical understanding of music that went beyond simple melody. These ancient players knew that tightening a string raised its pitch, that longer strings produced deeper sounds, and that certain combinations of notes sounded more pleasing than others. Meanwhile, along the Nile, Egyptian civilization was developing its own rich musical culture. Tomb paintings from various dynasties show us musicians holding instruments with remarkable clarity. There are harps of different sizes, some small enough to hold in the lap, others taller than the person playing them. There are flutes made from reed and percussion instruments including drums and sistrums, a kind of rattle that produced a shimmering sound particularly associated with religious rituals. The Egyptians believed music had power beyond entertainment. It could honor the gods, soothe the living, and even accompany the deceased into the afterlife. The construction of these early instruments required both artistry and technical knowledge. A harp maker needed to understand which woods would resonate properly, how to create a frame strong enough to withstand the tension of multiple strings, and how to position those strings to allow a player's fingers to move freely across them. Each instrument was largely handmade, often beautifully decorated, representing hours of skilled labor. The sound they produced was gentler than modern instruments, more intimate in scale, suited to the smaller spaces where people gathered. Far to the east, in the Yellow River Valley, Chinese craftsmen were pioneering entirely different approaches to organized sound. By the Shang dynasty, more than 3,000 years ago, they had begun casting bronze bells with extraordinary precision. These bells, called bianzhong, were not round like later Western bells, but flattened into an almond-like shape. This unusual form gave them a remarkable property. Each bell could produce two distinct tones depending on where it was struck. Archaeological discoveries, particularly the magnificent set of 65 bells found in the tomb of Marquis Yi of Zheng, have allowed modern researchers to hear the sound world of ancient China. The bells produce clear, sustained tones that seem to hang in the air, overlapping and creating complex layers of sound. Chinese musicians also developed string instruments, including early forms of the zither, percussion instruments made from stone, and bamboo flutes. Each material, they believed, represented a different aspect of the natural world. Metal instruments connected to autumn, stone to winter, silk strings to spring. This philosophical approach to music, seeing it as a mirror of natural harmony and cosmic order, would deeply influence Chinese musical thought for thousands of years to come. In the Indus Valley and later Vedic India, musical traditions were developing that would become inseparable from spiritual practice. Ancient texts called the Vedas, some of which may date back 3,000 years or more, were not simply read, but chanted according to specific melodic patterns. The precise intonation of these chants was considered essential to their effectiveness. Early Indian musicians developed drums of various sizes, cymbals, and flutes, but also gave extensive thought to the human voice as an instrument. The classification of sounds, the division of octaves into smaller intervals than Western music would later use, and the connection between specific melodic patterns and particular times of day or seasons of the year all began to take shape during this ancient period. Each of these civilizations was working with the same basic physics of sound. A column of air vibrating in a tube, a string stretched and plucked, a membrane struck, a piece of metal resonating. These fundamental sound production methods were being explored independently across thousands of miles. Yet the musical systems that emerged were distinct, shaped by language, belief, available materials, and aesthetic preferences that were unique to each culture. What united all these early instrument makers was careful observation and patient experimentation. They noticed that pipes of the same width but different lengths produced different pitches. They discovered that the material an instrument was made from affected not just its durability, but its sound quality. They learned that hollow chambers could amplify quiet sounds, that sympathetic strings could be made to resonate in response to others, and that rhythm could be made complex and precise through careful construction of drums and other percussion instruments. These ancient musicians were not working towards some distant goal of musical perfection. They were responding to the needs of their communities, creating sounds for celebrations and ceremonies, for mourning and meditation, for communication with the divine and entertainment of the powerful. The instruments they crafted, some of which have survived to let us glimpse their world, represent humanity's growing mastery over the physics of sound and our deepening understanding that organized tones could carry meaning, emotion, and beauty in ways that words alone could not achieve. The ancient Greeks lived in a world of patterns. They watched the moon cycle through its phases with mathematical regularity. They observed the seasons returning in predictable order. They noticed that certain geometric proportions appeared again and again in nature, in the spiral of a nautilus shell, in the petals of a flower, in the proportions of the human body itself. So when these keen observers turned their attention to music, they approached it not merely as entertainment or emotional expression, but as something that might reveal fundamental truths about the universe. The story begins, as many great discoveries do, with a simple observation. Around the 6th century before the Common Era, in the Greek city of Samos, the philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras conducted an experiment that would change how humanity understood sound forever. According to the accounts passed down through history, he was walking past a blacksmith's workshop when he noticed something peculiar. The hammers striking the anvils produced different tones, and some combinations of these tones sounded pleasing, while others created discord. Rather than simply enjoying or dismissing these sounds, Pythagoras wondered why. He began to investigate systematically, bringing the same rigorous thinking that he applied to geometry and numbers. Working with a monochord, a simple instrument consisting of a single string stretched over a wooden resonator, he discovered something remarkable. When he divided the string exactly in half and plucked both portions, the two sounds blended together so perfectly they seemed almost like the same note, just higher and lower. This was the interval we now call an octave, and it corresponded to the mathematical ratio of 2 to 1. The discovery grew more intriguing as Pythagoras continued his experiments. When he pressed the string at 2/3 of its length, creating a ratio of 3 to 2, he found another harmonious interval, one that sounded stable and pleasing. This was the perfect fifth, an interval that would become foundational to Western music. Pressing at 3/4 of the length, a ratio of 4 to 3 produced yet another concordant sound, the perfect fourth. These simple whole number ratios, 2 to 1, 3 to 2, 4 to 3, created the intervals that sounded most harmonious to the human ear. For Pythagoras and his followers, this was more than a curious fact about strings and sounds. It was evidence that the universe itself operated according to mathematical principles. If something as intangible and emotional as music could be explained through numbers, what else might be governed by similar hidden mathematics? The Pythagoreans began to see numerical relationships everywhere, believing that number was the fundamental nature of all reality. This discovery led to one of the most beautiful and enduring ideas in ancient philosophy, the concept of the music of the spheres. The Pythagoreans reasoned that if strings of different lengths produced harmonious sounds based on mathematical ratios, then the planets and celestial bodies, moving through the heavens at different distances and speeds, must also create a kind of cosmic harmony. They imagined that the universe itself was a grand musical instrument, with each planet producing its own tone as it traveled through space, all blending together in a perfect celestial symphony. This music was inaudible to human ears, they believed, not because it was silent, but because it was constant, a sound we had heard since birth and therefore could not distinguish from silence. The mathematical understanding of musical intervals allowed Greek theorists to develop the first formal scales and modes. They identified different patterns of whole tones and semitones that could be arranged between the notes of an octave. Each of these patterns, which they called modes, had its own character and emotional quality. The Dorian mode was thought to inspire courage and stability. The Phrygian mode was associated with religious ecstasy. The Lydian mode was considered relaxing, perhaps too relaxing, as some Greek writers worried it might make people lazy or weak. This idea that different musical patterns could affect human behavior was taken quite seriously in ancient Greece. Plato, writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, devoted considerable attention to music in his discussions of the ideal society. He believed that the modes young people listened to would shape their character, and he advocated for strict regulation of music in education. The Dorian and Phrygian modes were acceptable for training citizens, he argued, while other modes might corrupt moral development. Music was not mere entertainment. It was a force that could strengthen or weaken the very fabric of society. Aristotle, Plato's student, also contemplated the nature of music and its effects on the human soul. He recognized that music had the power to represent emotions and that listening to music could purify the emotions, a concept he called catharsis. Unlike his teacher, Aristotle was less concerned with restricting certain types of music and more interested in understanding why music affected people the way it did. The Greek understanding of musical mathematics spread throughout the ancient world. When the Romans absorbed Greek culture, they inherited these theories about harmony and intervals. When Greek texts were later translated into Arabic during the Islamic Golden Age, scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba studied and built upon Pythagorean musical theory. Centuries later, when these texts were translated from Arabic into Latin, they would inspire medieval European monks and scholars to develop Western music theory further. Yet for all their sophisticated mathematics, the the Greeks maintained instruments that would seem quite simple to modern eyes. The lyre, with its 7 strings, was the instrument most associated with musical education and poetry. The aulos, a double-reed instrument often played in pairs, provided music for festivals and theatrical performances. The kithara, a larger and more elaborate relative of the lyre, was the instrument of professional musicians. These were not instruments of great complexity, but in the hands of skilled players, guided by the theoretical understanding of intervals and modes, they could produce music that moved audiences to tears or ecstasy. The mathematical ratios that Pythagoras discovered on his monochord remain fundamental to music today. When we tune a guitar or a piano, when we sing in harmony, when we recognize that 2 notes an octave apart seem to share an essential quality despite their different pitches, we are experiencing the same relationships that the ancient Greeks identified more than 2,000 years ago. The tools and instruments have evolved beyond anything Pythagoras could have imagined, but the mathematical truth he uncovered about the nature of harmonious sound remains constant, a genuine discovery about how the physical world works and how human perception responds to pattern and proportion in the invisible medium of sound. As we journey eastward from the Mediterranean world, where Pythagoras discovered the mathematical relationships within music, we enter ancient civilizations that were developing their own sophisticated musical traditions along entirely different paths. While the Greeks were measuring string lengths and theorizing about planetary harmonies, cultures across Asia were weaving music into the very fabric of their philosophies, creating instruments of remarkable subtlety and building systems of sound that would endure for millennia. In ancient China, music was never merely entertainment or even art in the way we might think of it today. It was considered a fundamental force of nature, as essential to proper governance and cosmic order as the movements of the stars or the changing of seasons. The Chinese character for music, yue, shares its origins with the character for joy and harmony, revealing how deeply intertwined these concepts were in Chinese thought. Confucius himself, the great philosopher who lived around 500 years before the Common Era, believed that music had the power to perfect human character and maintain social harmony. He argued that a kingdom's music reflected the virtue of its rulers, and that by listening to a nation's songs, one could judge whether that nation was well governed. The Chinese developed an elaborate classification system for musical instruments, organizing them not by how they were played, but by the materials from which they were made. There were 8 categories: instruments made of metal, stone, silk, bamboo, wood, clay, gourd, and hide. This system, known as the Bayin, reflected the Chinese understanding that different materials resonated with different elements of nature and different aspects of human experience. A bronze bell and a stone chime might produce similar pitches, but the quality of their sounds spoke to different aspects of the natural world. Among all these instruments, one held special significance for scholars and philosophers. The gyukin, a 7-stringed zither, became the instrument of the refined mind, the companion of poets and sages. Unlike instruments used in ceremonial music or popular entertainment, the gyukin was played quietly, often for an audience of one or even for no audience at all, except the player. Its construction was an art form requiring years of careful work. The soundboard was carved from special paulownia wood, chosen for its resonance and aged for years before use. The bottom of the instrument was crafted from a denser wood, often catalpa or Chinese fir, creating a chamber that could transform the vibrations of silk strings into sounds of remarkable complexity. Playing the gyukin required not just technical skill, but a cultivated inner stillness. The musician would sit in a quiet room, often with incense burning, and coaxed from the strings sounds that ranged from bell-like harmonics to deep, earthen tones. The repertoire included pieces with names like Wild Geese Descending on the Sandbank and three variations on Plum Blossoms, compositions that sought to capture natural scenes and seasons not through literal imitation, but through the essence of feeling they evoked. Some pieces were so old that their origins disappeared into legend, passed down through generations of players who preserved them with careful notation systems that used characters to indicate not just which notes to play, but how to shape each sound with subtle variations in pressure, vibration, and release. Far to the south, the musical traditions of India were developing along their own extraordinary path. Indian music theory recognized that sound itself was a manifestation of the divine, and that certain combinations of tones could align human consciousness with cosmic forces. From this understanding emerged the raga system, one of the most sophisticated melodic frameworks ever developed. A raga is far more than a scale or mode in the Western sense. Each raga is an entire universe of melodic possibility, a specific arrangement of notes with prescribed patterns of ascent and descent, particular notes to be emphasized, characteristic ornamentations, and even specific times of day or seasons when the raga should be performed. The theory behind ragas recognized that certain sequences of tones could evoke specific emotions or rasas. There were ragas for the quiet coolness of early morning, ragas for the heat of noon, ragas for the contemplative hours of evening. Some ragas were considered to have such power that they could influence the weather or the natural world. The legendary musician Tansen, who would live many centuries later, was said to have sung a raga associated with fire with such intensity that lamps around him burst into flame, and then had to sing a raga of rain to cool the burning air. Whether or not such stories hold literal truth, they reveal the profound belief in music's power that characterized Indian musical philosophy. Indian instruments evolved to serve these complex musical needs. The veena, a stringed instrument with a history stretching back thousands of years, featured carefully placed frets that allowed players to find the subtle microtonal variations essential to proper raga performance. The tampura, with its 4 or 5 strings, was designed not for melody, but to create a continuous drone, a sonic foundation that established the tonal center and provided a shimmering background against which melodic exploration could unfold. This drone, seemingly simple, was considered essential, creating a sound environment that could support meditative states and allow both musician and listener to enter more deeply into the raga's emotional world. In Japan, music developed close connections with ritual and theater. The gagaku, court music that came to Japan from China and Korea around the 6th century of the Common Era, was refined into a uniquely Japanese form characterized by slow, stately melodies and exotic timbres. The shakuhachi, a bamboo flute, became an instrument of Zen Buddhist meditation. Its breathy, haunting tones considered a form of spiritual practice in themselves. To play a single note properly on the shakuhachi could take years of practice. As the player learned to control breath and embouchure to create the subtle variations in pitch and timbre that gave the instrument its distinctive voice. Across all these Eastern traditions, we find a common thread that distinguishes them from the Greek approach we encountered earlier, where Pythagoras and his followers sought to understand music through measurement and mathematical ratio. The Eastern traditions emphasized the inner experience of sound, the cultivation of sensitivity to subtle variations in tone and timbre, and the belief that music could serve as a bridge between human consciousness and larger cosmic patterns. The instruments were designed not to produce perfect mathematical intervals, but to allow for the nuanced expression of emotion and the subtle shadings that made each performance unique. As night deepens and we contemplate these ancient Eastern musical worlds, we can imagine the scholar alone with a guqin, fingers moving across silk strings in a quiet room lit by a single lamp. We can hear the tampura's endless drone creating a sonic mandala in an Indian temple courtyard as the sun sets. We can picture the deliberate, ceremonial movements of gagaku musicians in a Japanese palace, their instruments producing sounds that seem to slow time itself. These traditions developed over centuries, refined by countless musicians who understood that music was not simply organized sound, but a pathway to understanding the deeper harmonies that structure all existence. As the centuries turned and the Roman Empire faded into memory, the music of daily life in Europe gradually transformed. The secular songs of merchants and farmers, the instrumental melodies of wandering entertainers, the refined court music of earlier civilizations, all these sounds began to recede as a new force emerged to shape the musical landscape. The Christian Church, spreading across the European continent, would become the great preserver and organizer of musical knowledge during the long period we now call the Middle Ages. In monasteries scattered from Ireland to Italy, from Spain to the Germanic lands, monks lived lives structured by prayer and contemplation. Their days moved in cycles marked by specific prayer services, occurring at regular intervals from before dawn until after dusk. These services required music, and in meeting this need, the Church developed something unprecedented, a unified musical tradition that would spread across vast distances and endure for centuries. The music these monks created was unlike anything that had come before in the Western world. It consisted of a single melodic line, sung without instrumental accompaniment, rising and falling in gentle waves that seemed to float in the stone spaces of churches and chapels. This music came to be known as plain chant, or more specifically, Gregorian chant, named after Pope Gregory I, who lived around the year 600. While Gregory himself may not have composed these melodies, tradition credits him with organizing and standardizing the vast repertoire of chants used in Christian worship. Imagine the sound of 30 or 40 male voices, unified in purpose, singing a single melodic line that moves stepwise, rarely jumping to distant notes. There is no harmony in the way we understand it today, no chords supporting a melody. Instead, there is just this one graceful line of music, each syllable of Latin text carried on carefully chosen notes. The rhythm follows the natural flow of the words rather than a strict beat. The effect in a stone church, with its natural reverberation, creates an almost otherworldly quality, as if the music emerges from the architecture itself. The modes used in this music descended from ancient Greek theory, though transformed by centuries of use and adaptation. Monks did not think in terms of our modern major and minor scales. Instead, they worked with 8 distinct modes, each with its own character and emotional quality. One mode might feel bright and uplifting, another contemplative and somber, another mysterious and searching. These modes provided different colors for different texts and different occasions in the church calendar. What makes this period particularly significant in the history of music is not merely the beauty of the chants themselves, but what the monks did to preserve and transmit them. In an age when most people could neither read nor write, when knowledge was fragile and easily lost, the monasteries became centers of learning and preservation. Monks painstakingly copied manuscripts by hand, including books that contain the texts and music for their services. But how does one write down music? How do you capture something as ephemeral as sound and fix it on parchment so that someone else, perhaps in a different location or a different century, can recreate it? This question led to one of the most important developments in musical history, the gradual invention of musical notation. The earliest attempts were simple marks above the text, small curves and lines called neumes. These marks indicated the general direction the melody should move, up or down, by step or by leap. They served as reminders for singers who already knew the melodies, rather than precise instructions for learning new ones. A neume might show that the voice should rise on a particular syllable, but it wouldn't specify exactly how much higher the note should be. Over generations, these notational systems became more precise. Around the year 1000, a monk named Guido of Arezzo made several innovations that would fundamentally change music. He proposed using horizontal lines to represent specific pitches, so that notes placed on different lines or in different spaces would indicate exact melodic intervals. At first, there might be just one or two lines, colored differently to indicate different pitch levels. Gradually, this evolved into the four-line staff that became standard for chant notation, and eventually into the five-line staff we use today. Guido made another contribution that singers still use in our own time. He developed a system for teaching singers to recognize intervals, the distances between notes. He took a well-known hymn in which each phrase began on successively higher notes and used the first syllable of each phrase as a name for that note. Ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. These syllables, slightly modified, became the do, re, mi that children learn today. With this system, singers could learn to read new music without having heard it before, a revolutionary concept. As musical notation became more sophisticated, something else became possible. Composers began to experiment with adding a second melodic line to the original chant. This development, occurring gradually between roughly 900 and 1200, marked the beginning of polyphony in Western music with multiple independent voice parts. The earliest polyphony was quite simple. A second voice might sing the same melody as the first, but starting on a different pitch, usually a perfect fourth or fifth away. The two voices would move in parallel, maintaining the same interval throughout. This parallel organum, as it was called, created a fuller sound than a single melodic line, but the voices did not yet have true independence. Over time, composers grew bolder. They allowed the added voice to move in contrary motion, going down when the original chant went up, or vice versa. They experimented with different intervals and with holding one voice on a sustained note, while another moved more freely above or below it. The Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris became a particularly important center for this developing art, and composers associated with Notre Dame in the late 1100s created increasingly elaborate polyphonic works. These developments occurred slowly over centuries in an era when communication was difficult and change happened at a pace almost unimaginable to us today. A musical innovation in one monastery might take decades to spread to another region. Yet the written notation made such spreading possible. A manuscript could travel where a singer could not, carrying musical ideas across mountains and seas. Throughout this period, the Church remained the primary patron and preserver of musical knowledge in Europe. Secular music certainly existed. Farmers sang work songs, nobles enjoyed instrumental dances and songs of courtly love, traveling entertainers performed for crowds, but this music was rarely written down. It lived in memory and died when its performers did. The church music, carefully notated and copied, survived. The monks who spent their lives in these musical pursuits were not thinking about innovation or progress. They were seeking to praise their Creator in the most beautiful way they knew. Yet in doing so, they built the foundation for all the musical developments that would follow. They created the notational system that would allow Beethoven to write symphonies and jazz musicians to share arrangements. They explored the principles of polyphony that would lead to the complex harmonies of later centuries. In their quiet scriptoriums and echoing chapels, they were preserving more than melodies. They were preserving the very possibility of musical knowledge accumulating across generations, building higher and higher on foundations that would not be forgotten. The monasteries of medieval Europe had given music a structure and a language through their careful preservation of chant traditions. But as generations of monks copied manuscripts and sang their daily prayers, a quiet revolution was taking shape on the pages of illuminated texts. The very way humans could think about music was about to transform, and it would happen through marks on parchment. In the darkness before dawn, a monk named Guido sat in the scriptorium of the Benedictine monastery at Arezzo in northern Italy. The year was somewhere around 1025, and Guido faced a problem that had frustrated music teachers for centuries. When new brothers arrived at the monastery, it took them nearly 10 years to learn the vast repertoire of chants they would need to sing throughout the liturgical year. 10 years of listening, repeating, memorizing, with no reliable way to show what a melody looked like, except to sing it again and again. The notation that existed at the time consisted of simple marks called neumes, little squiggles and curves written above the text of prayers. These neumes showed whether the melody went up or down, whether notes should be sung smoothly or separately, but they couldn't show how far up or down the melody moved. A singer who had never heard a particular chant could look at its neumes and still have no idea what to sing. Guido observed how difficult it was to keep the enormous body of sacred music alive when it lived only in human memory and these vague directional hints. He began experimenting with something different. What if the neumes were placed at specific heights corresponding to specific pitches? He drew horizontal lines on the parchment, first one line, then two, then four. Each line and each space between lines represented a particular note. When a neume was placed on a line, you sang that line's pitch. When placed in a space, you sang that space's pitch. The effect was immediate and remarkable. For the first time, a singer looking at written music could know exactly which notes to sing, even if they had never heard the melody before. The time required to train new choir members dropped from 10 years to something more like 2. Guido's innovation spread across Europe with surprising speed, copied from monastery to monastery, modified and refined as it traveled. But Guido contributed something else equally transformative. To help singers learn and remember the different pitches, he created a teaching method using a hymn that everyone knew, a prayer to Saint John. Each phrase of this hymn happened to begin one note higher than the previous phrase, creating a natural ladder of sound. The Latin text began, Ut quint laxis, resonea fibris, mira gestorum, famulae tuorum, solve polluti, labii ritum. Guido suggested that singers could remember the pitches by remembering these syllables, ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. These syllables gave names to the relationships between notes, creating a system we still use today. Later centuries would change ut to the more singable do and add t to complete the scale. But Guido had given musicians a way to think about and communicate musical ideas without needing to sing them first. As the medieval period continued, notation grew more sophisticated. The 4-line staff that Guido popularized eventually became 5 lines, offering more range. Scribes developed different shapes of notes to indicate not just pitch, but also duration. A square note might be held longer than a diamond-shaped one. Stems and flags were added to show rhythmic relationships. By the 13th century, a French composer and theorist named Franco of Cologne was writing treatises that codified rhythmic notation into a system where note shapes had specific time values in relation to each other. Music could now specify not only what pitches to sing, but exactly how long to hold each one and how they fit together in time. The mathematics of rhythm could finally be seen. This development changed everything about what music could be. When melody alone lived in memory and oral tradition, it remained relatively simple by necessity. Complex compositions couldn't be preserved. But once music could be written with precision, composers could craft intricate works that would have been impossible to teach through demonstration alone. Multiple voice parts could be carefully composed to weave together in predetermined ways, each singer reading their own line while trusting that the other parts would interlock correctly. The great medieval musical form called organum, where multiple voices sang independent melodies that harmonized together, became possible only because notation allowed this complexity to be captured. Composers at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, including Violin and Pérotin, created compositions of startling intricacy during the 12th and 13th centuries, with 3 or even 4 voice parts moving in carefully calculated relationships. Notation also meant that music could travel in new ways. A composition created in Paris could be copied and sent to London, to Rome, to Cologne. Musicians separated by hundreds of miles could perform the same piece. Musical ideas could spread without requiring the composer to travel or even to be alive. A manuscript could preserve a melody for generations, for centuries. The process of developing notation happened slowly, through countless small innovations by scribes and teachers whose names we will never know. They tried different systems, different symbols, different ways of organizing information on the page. Some innovations caught on and spread. Others were tried and abandoned. Over several centuries, through this gradual collective refinement, Western music developed a written language as sophisticated as written words. Not every musical tradition followed this path. Many of the world's rich musical cultures continued to pass their art from teacher to student through demonstration and practice, trusting in memory and improvisation rather than fixing every note on paper. Indian classical music, with its elaborate raga system, remained primarily an oral tradition. So did much of African and Middle Eastern music. Each approach had its own advantages. Oral traditions maintained flexibility and encouraged improvisation. Written traditions allowed precise preservation of complex compositions. But for the European musical tradition, notation became fundamental. It shaped what kinds of music could be imagined. It allowed the great architectural compositions of later centuries, with their carefully planned modulations and returns, their fugues with themes that appear and reappear in different voices, their symphonies with themes that echo across multiple movements. As the 14th century progressed, notation continued to evolve. Red ink was sometimes used alongside black to indicate rhythmic modifications. Signs and symbols accumulated to show dynamics, articulation, ornamentation. The language grew richer, more specific, more capable of capturing the composer's intentions. In quiet scriptoria across Europe, monks and scholars refined this revolutionary technology. Each manuscript took weeks or months to copy by hand, each note carefully inscribed with quill and ink. The pages glowed with decorated initial letters and careful musical symbols, preserving melodies that would outlive their creators by centuries. The invention of musical notation stands as one of humanity's great intellectual achievements, as significant as written language itself. It allowed music to become something that could be studied, analyzed, built upon across generations. It transformed sound, which exists only in the moment, and then vanishes into something visible and permanent. It turned music from something you could only experience in real time into something you could see, examine, and recreate at will. As innovations in notation reached their mature medieval form by around 1400, the stage was set for music to become more complex, more expressive, and more widely shared than ever before. The Renaissance was approaching, and with it would come an explosion of musical creativity made possible by the humble staff lines and note shapes that now let composers write down exactly what they heard in their imagination. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century changed civilization in countless ways, and music was no exception. As the Renaissance dawned across Europe, the ability to print musical scores meant that a composition created in Venice could be performed in London, Paris, or Madrid with remarkable accuracy. The notes that a composer carefully arranged could now travel far beyond the reach of their own voice or instrument, preserved in ink on paper, waiting to be brought to life by musicians they would never meet. This technological revolution arrived at a moment when European culture was already experiencing a profound transformation. The Renaissance, which began in Italy around 1400 and gradually spread northward over the next 2 centuries, represented a rebirth of interest in human potential, artistic expression, and the beauty of the natural world. In painting, artists discovered perspective and began capturing light in revolutionary ways. In architecture, buildings reached toward the sky with new mathematical precision. And in music, composers began weaving together multiple independent melodic lines into intricate tapestries of sound that seemed to mirror the complexity and wonder of creation itself. This technique, called polyphony, had existed in simpler forms during the medieval period, but Renaissance composers elevated it to an art form of breathtaking sophistication. Where earlier sacred music had featured perhaps 2 or 3 voice parts moving together, composers now crafted pieces with 4, 5, or even more independent vocal lines, each with its own melodic integrity, yet all combining to create harmonies that seemed to float weightlessly in the vaulted spaces of cathedrals and chapels. The musical landscape of the Renaissance was dominated by vocal music, and the Catholic Church remained the primary patron and context for the most elaborate compositions. Yet the relationship between music and the sacred was evolving. Composers began to see their work not merely as a vehicle for worship, but as an expression of human creativity that reflected divine order. The same mathematical proportions that governed the movement of planets and the structure of great buildings could be found in the careful spacing of musical intervals and the elegant unfolding of melodic phrases. Among the most celebrated composers of the early Renaissance was Josquin des Prez, who lived from approximately 1450 to 1521. Though exact details of his early life remain somewhat mysterious, his music spoke with such clarity and emotional depth that he became renowned throughout Europe during his lifetime. Josquin had a remarkable gift for setting text to music in ways that seemed to illuminate the meaning of every word. When the text spoke of ascending to heaven, his melodic lines would climb upward. When the words conveyed sorrow, the harmonies would shift in ways that tugged at the heart. His masses and motets demonstrated how multiple voices could move together like dancers, sometimes echoing one another, sometimes proceeding in contrary directions, yet always maintaining a sense of balance and purpose. The printing press allowed Josquin's compositions to spread throughout Europe with unprecedented speed. Music publishers, particularly in Venice, began producing volumes of polyphonic music that found their way into churches, noble courts, and wealthy homes across the continent. For the first time, a standardized repertoire of composed music began to emerge, replacing the regional variations and oral traditions that had characterized earlier eras. As the 16th century progressed, the Renaissance reached its full flowering. Composers continued to refine the art of polyphony, creating works of ever greater complexity while maintaining a sense of transparency and grace. The human voice remained the primary instrument, and composers wrote for its natural capabilities, creating melodies that felt satisfying to sing and beautiful to hear. Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, who spent most of his career in Rome during the mid to late 1500s, brought Renaissance polyphony to perhaps its most refined expression. His music possessed a quality of serene clarity, with each voice part flowing smoothly through carefully controlled melodic curves. Palestrina's compositions seemed to embody an ideal of sacred beauty, neither too simple nor too complex, always serving the liturgical texts while creating sonic environments that lifted listeners toward contemplation. During this same period, the role of secular music began to expand significantly. The madrigal, a form of polyphonic song typically written for 4 or 5 voices, became enormously popular among educated Europeans. These pieces set poetry to music, often exploring themes of love, nature, and human emotion with a directness that would have been inappropriate in sacred contexts. Italian composers pioneered the form, creating madrigals that used vivid musical gestures to paint the images described in the text. The technique, known as word painting, might feature descending melodic lines for words about falling or death, or quick, light rhythms for references to birds or laughter. The madrigal spread from Italy to England, where composers like Thomas Morley and Thomas Weelkes adapted the form to English texts and sensibilities. In wealthy homes, groups of friends would gather to sing madrigals together, reading from part books that contained only their individual vocal lines. This form of amateur music making represented something new in European culture. Composed polyphonic music designed for private enjoyment rather than religious worship or courtly ceremony. The Renaissance also saw the development of instrumental music as an independent art form, though it still remained secondary to vocal composition. Instruments had long played supporting roles, doubling vocal lines or providing accompaniment, but composers now began writing pieces specifically designed for instruments. The lute, a plucked string instrument with a rounded back, became especially popular for solo performance and accompaniment. Families of recorders and viols were developed in different sizes, allowing instruments to take on the soprano, alto, tenor, and bass roles that voices performed in polyphonic compositions. As the 16th century drew to a close, the musical language of the Renaissance had created a foundation upon which all subsequent Western music would build. Composers had thoroughly explored the possibilities of combining independent melodic lines into coherent harmonic structures. They had established principles of consonance and dissonance, learning which combinations of notes felt stable and restful, and which created tension that demanded resolution. The major and minor scales that would dominate Western music for centuries had emerged from the older modal systems inherited from medieval theory. The printing press had transformed music from an ephemeral art, existing only in the moment of performance, into something that could be preserved, studied, and transmitted across vast distances. A composition was now an object, a score that could be owned, collected, and interpreted by musicians who brought their own artistry to its realization. This separation between composer and performer would grow increasingly important in the centuries to come, shaping how musical creativity was understood and valued. As the Renaissance gave way to new artistic movements, the tools and techniques developed during these 2 centuries remained essential. The careful balance of multiple voices, the attention to text setting, and the exploration of harmony as an expressive force would continue to resonate through the grand orchestral works, intimate chamber music, and innovative experiments that lay ahead in music's ever-unfolding story. As the Renaissance gave way to new centuries of musical exploration, a transformation was taking place in the workshops of northern Italy that would shape the sound of music for generations to come. In the towns and cities clustered around Cremona, Brescia, and Venice, craftsmen were perfecting instruments that would soon become the most prized and recognizable voices in all of Western music. The violin family emerged gradually from earlier bowed instruments, each generation of makers refining what had come before. The medieval fiddle, the rebec, and the viol had established the basic principle of drawing horsehair across strings to create sustained sound. But these earlier instruments lacked the power, the range, and the expressiveness that composers and performers increasingly desired. Something new was needed, and in the hands of Italian craftsmen, that something began to take shape. Andrea Amati, working in Cremona in the mid-16th century, created instruments that established many of the proportions and characteristics we still recognize today. His violins possessed a distinctive arched body, carefully graduated wood thickness, and a varnish that protected while allowing the wood to resonate freely. These were not experimental curiosities, but fully realized instruments that could sing with a human-like voice, capable of expressing everything from the gentlest whisper to passionate declaration. What made these instruments so special was not any single innovation, but rather the subtle integration of countless details. The maple back reflected sound forward, while the spruce top vibrated with responsive sensitivity. The F-shaped sound holes allowed air to move in and out as the body resonated. The bridge, seemingly just a simple wooden support for the strings, actually transmitted vibrations in complex patterns across the instrument's body. The bass bar inside strengthened the structure while channeling certain frequencies. Every curve, every thickness, every choice of wood contributed to the final voice. As Andrea Amati's sons and grandson continued the family tradition, other makers in Cremona were developing their own approaches. The Guarneri family created instruments with bold, powerful voices. But it was Antonio Stradivari, born in 1644, who would become the most celebrated violin maker in history. Working well into his 90s, Stradivari created over 1,000 instruments, each one a masterpiece of proportion and craft. Stradivari's violins achieved something remarkable. They projected sound with unprecedented clarity and volume, allowing a single player to be heard in increasingly large concert halls. Their tonal quality possessed complexity and richness that seemed almost alive, changing character depending on how they were played. The finest Stradivari violins remain the most coveted instruments in the world, their sound unmistakable to trained ears. The exact secret of Stradivari's success remains debated to this day. Some point to the particular wood available during his lifetime, trees that grew during a period of climate change that created unusually dense annual rings. Others suggest the varnish contained special ingredients now lost to history. Modern analysis has revealed that Stradivari treated the wood with minerals and other compounds that may have enhanced its acoustic properties. But perhaps the real secret was simpler: decades of experience, an exceptional ear, and meticulous attention to every detail. The violin itself was joined by larger siblings. The viola, tuned a fifth lower, provided a warmer middle voice. The cello, held between the knees, offered rich bass tones that could sustain melodic lines just as expressively as the violin. The double bass, largest of all, provided foundation and depth. Together, these instruments formed a family of perfectly matched voices, capable of blending seamlessly or standing alone as solo instruments. These bowed strings offered composers something no other instruments could quite match. Unlike the harpsichord, which could not vary its volume, or wind instruments, which required pauses for breath, the violin family could sustain notes indefinitely while swelling from the softest whisper to powerful declaration. A skilled player could make a single note bloom and fade like a human voice, could execute passages of breathtaking speed, or could draw out long, singing melodies that seemed to float above all other sounds. The playing techniques developed during this period remain fundamental to string performance today. Composers and performers discovered vibrato, that slight wavering of pitch that adds warmth and expressiveness. They developed various bowing techniques, learning that the speed, pressure, and position of the bow could dramatically alter the character of sound. Playing near the bridge produced bright, intense tones, while bowing near the fingerboard created a softer, more mysterious quality. As these instruments spread beyond Italy, they became central to musical life across Europe. Royal courts established string ensembles. Churches incorporated violins into sacred music, though some conservative congregations initially resisted, considering them too secular and dance-like. Gradually, resistance faded as the instrument's expressive capabilities proved irresistible. The supremacy of Italian violin making created a tradition that persists to this day. While makers in France, Germany, and England developed their own excellent instruments, the Cremonese standard remained the ideal. Young violin makers traveled to Italy to learn the craft, and Italian instruments commanded premium prices. The basic design that Amati, Stradivari, and their contemporaries perfected has remained essentially unchanged for over 4 centuries, a remarkable testament to how thoroughly they solved the acoustic challenges they faced. This consistency of design is unusual in the history of musical instruments. Most instruments continued evolving, adding keys, valves, and other mechanisms to improve their capabilities. But the violin emerged in such refined form that later makers found little to improve. Modern violins might use different materials for strings or incorporate subtle adjustments in setup, but the fundamental architecture remains as it was in 17th century Cremona. As these instruments took their place at the heart of European musical life, they shaped the very sound that composers imagined. The orchestra was being born, and bowed strings would form its foundation and its soul, their voices blending and soaring through the musical revolutions yet to come. As the violin family established its voice across Europe, a new age of musical complexity was dawning. The period from 1600 to 1750 would come to be known as the Baroque era, a time when composers began to weave intricate patterns of sound with mathematical precision, when orchestras grew from modest chamber groups into more elaborate ensembles, and when music became both an intellectual pursuit and an emotional experience unlike anything heard before. The word Baroque itself would later be used to describe the ornate, elaborate style that characterized this period. Just as architects filled cathedrals with gilded details and swirling decorations, composers filled their scores with runs of notes that cascaded like water over stone, with harmonies that twisted and resolved in unexpected ways, and with structures that revealed careful planning beneath their apparent spontaneity. In the early 1600s, a revolutionary form of musical storytelling emerged in Italy. Opera combined singing, orchestral music, and theatrical performance into a single art form that could move audiences to tears or laughter. Claudio Monteverdi, working in Mantua and later Venice, demonstrated how music could express human emotions with unprecedented directness. His opera Orpheus, first performed in 1607, featured an orchestra of around 40 instruments, far larger than typical ensembles of the time. The score called for violins and violas, harpsichords and organs, trumpets and trombones, even unusual instruments like the chitarrone, a large theorbo with bass strings that created a rich, resonant foundation. The orchestras of this period began to standardize, though they remained smaller and more flexible than the symphonic ensembles that would come later. A typical Baroque orchestra might include a corps of strings, perhaps a dozen or 20 players, supported by a continuous section where harpsichord and cello worked together to provide harmonic foundation. To this basic framework, composers could add winds and brass depending on the music's needs and the resources available. There was no single conductor in our modern sense. Instead, the harpsichordist or the leading violinist would guide the ensemble, maintaining unity through gesture and eye contact. As the 1700s progressed, certain forms became dominant in instrumental music. The concerto emerged as a structure where one or more solo instruments could dialogue with the full orchestra, creating contrasts between the individual voice and the collective sound. Antonio Vivaldi, a red-haired priest who taught violin at a girls' orphanage in Venice, composed hundreds of concertos that explored these possibilities. His Four Seasons, a set of violin concertos published in 1725, demonstrated how music could paint pictures, evoking birdsong in spring, thunderstorms in summer, and the chill of winter wind through purely instrumental means. Meanwhile, in Germany, Johann Sebastian Bach was creating music of such structural complexity that it seemed to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. Working as a church musician in Leipzig, Bach composed cantatas for nearly every Sunday of the church year, each one a small masterwork combining voices, instruments, and intricate counterpoint. His ability to weave multiple independent melodic lines together created music where every voice mattered, where horizontal melodies and vertical harmonies formed architectures of sound that seemed both mathematically perfect and deeply expressive. Bach's keyboard music revealed the Baroque fascination with exploring every possibility within a system. His well-tempered clavier, completed in 2 books in 1722 and 1742, contained preludes and fugues in all 24 major and minor keys. This was partly a practical demonstration of new tuning systems that allowed keyboards to play equally well in any key, but it was also an intellectual and artistic challenge Bach set for himself to find unique character and beauty in each tonal realm. The fugue itself represented Baroque compositional thinking at its most sophisticated. A fugue begins with a single melodic line, a subject that states a musical idea. This subject then appears in different voices, weaving in and out, sometimes inverted or stretched or compressed, creating a tapestry where the same thread appears in many colors and positions. Listening to a well-crafted fugue, one can almost hear the composer's mind at work, following logical pathways while creating something that transcends mere mathematics to become art. In England, George Friedrich Handel brought Baroque grandeur to new heights with his oratorios, large-scale works for voices and orchestra that told biblical stories. His Messiah, first performed in Dublin in 1742, featured choruses of such power and brilliance that they still move audiences centuries later. The famous Hallelujah chorus demonstrates the Baroque love of textural variety, with voices sometimes singing together in unison, sometimes answering each other in quick succession, sometimes weaving independent lines that combine into magnificent whole. The Baroque period also saw developments in musical rhetoric, the idea that music could persuade and move listeners just as speech could. Composers developed a vocabulary of musical figures, specific patterns of notes that conveyed particular emotions or ideas. A descending chromatic line might represent grief or lamentation. Rapidly repeating notes could suggest agitation or excitement. These were not arbitrary associations, but part of a shared language between composers and informed listeners. Instruments themselves continued to evolve during this era. The trumpet gained new versatility through the development of playing techniques that allowed skilled musicians to access higher ranges where more notes became available. The oboe and bassoon were refined from earlier double-reed instruments. Their mechanisms improved to allow more precise intonation and greater range. The organ reached new heights of complexity, with some instruments featuring multiple keyboards and hundreds of pipes that could imitate everything from flutes to trumpets. As 1750 approached, the Baroque style had reached a kind of culmination. The mathematical complexity, the ornate decorative elements, the dramatic contrasts between loud and soft, fast and slow, solo and ensemble had all been explored thoroughly. Bach's death in 1750 is often taken as marking the end of the Baroque period, though of course musical styles do not change overnight. Already, new ideas were stirring, a desire for greater simplicity and clarity, for melodies that could be easily remembered and harmonies that followed more predictable patterns. Yet the Baroque legacy would endure. The establishment of the orchestra as a flexible ensemble capable of subtle shadings and powerful effects, the development of forms like the concerto and the fugue, the demonstration that instrumental music could express emotions and even tell stories without words. All these achievements would provide foundation for everything that followed. The violins that had found their perfect form in the previous century now had a vast repertoire that revealed their expressive range, from the intimate to the magnificent, from mathematical precision to profound human feeling. As the elaborate orchestras of the Baroque era continued to evolve and expand their repertoire, another revolution was quietly taking shape in workshops across Italy. In the early years of the 18th century, instrument makers were experimenting with a mechanism that would fundamentally alter the course of musical history. They were trying to solve a problem that had frustrated keyboard players for generations: the inability to control the volume of individual notes. The harpsichord, which had dominated keyboard music for nearly 300 years, produced sound by plucking strings with small quills or pieces of leather. No matter how gently or forcefully a player pressed the keys, each note emerged at essentially the same volume. A musician could add ornaments and vary the tempo, but the dynamic range remained stubbornly limited. Some harpsichords featured multiple keyboards and stops that could change the tone, but the fundamental limitation remained. Each note was either on or off, loud or soft, with no gradation in between. Around the year 1700, an instrument maker named Bartolomeo Cristofori, working in Florence under the patronage of the Medici family, completed an invention he called the gravissembolo col piano e forte, which translates to harpsichord with soft and loud. Instead of plucking the strings, Cristofori's mechanism used small hammers covered in leather to strike them. More importantly, these hammers would immediately fall away from the string after impact, allowing it to vibrate freely. The genius of the design lay in its responsiveness. The harder a player pressed a key, the more forcefully the hammer struck the string and the louder the note sounded. This seems simple to us now, but the mechanism required extraordinary precision. Cristofori had to invent an escapement system that allowed the hammer to strike and immediately retreat, even if the player continued holding down the key. He developed dampers that would stop the string from vibrating when the key was released. He experimented with different materials for the hammer coverings, seeking the perfect balance between force and tone quality. By 1720, he had refined his design to include a mechanism that prevented the hammer from bouncing back and striking the string multiple times, and another that allowed players to lift all the dampers at once, letting the strings ring sympathetically. The early instruments Cristofori built were quieter than modern pianos, with a more delicate voice, but they possessed something revolutionary: the ability to express emotion through touch alone. A player could now shape a melody with swells and diminuendos, could make one voice sing out while others whispered in accompaniment, could create the illusion of breathing within a musical phrase. The instrument gradually became known simply as the pianoforte, and eventually just the piano. For several decades, the piano remained a curiosity, overshadowed by the established harpsichord. Composers and performers had spent their entire lives mastering the harpsichord's particular demands, and the new instrument seemed like an unnecessary complication. The early pianos were expensive and somewhat unreliable. The mechanism was complex and prone to malfunction. Many musicians couldn't hear enough difference to justify abandoning their familiar instruments. But slowly, the piano's capabilities began to seduce composers who recognized its potential. In Germany, Gottfried Silbermann studied Cristofori's designs and began building his own instruments, making improvements that Johann Sebastian Bach himself would test and critique. The great composer initially found fault with the mechanism, particularly the heavy touch required in the upper registers, but Silbermann continued refining his work. By 1747, when Bach visited the court of Frederick the Great in Potsdam, the king proudly showed him several Silbermann pianos, and Bach played them with approval, even improvising a complex fugue that would later become part of his musical offering. As the instrument spread across Europe, different schools of building emerged. In England, makers like Johannes Zump developed a simpler, lighter action that became popular in homes. The English style produced a more robust, sustained tone. In Vienna, builders created instruments with a lighter, more responsive touch and a clearer, more transparent sound. These Viennese pianos would become the instruments that Mozart and later Beethoven knew and loved, quite different from the powerful concert grands we hear today. Mozart encountered the piano as a young man and quickly recognized its expressive possibilities. His piano concertos and sonatas explored the instrument's unique ability to blend power and delicacy, to shift instantly from thunderous chords to the most tender whispers. He could write passages that would have been impossible on the harpsichord, where the melody swells and recedes like waves, where the left and right hands seem to converse in different emotional registers. The piano allowed him to compose music that felt more like human speech, more capable of capturing the subtle shifts of feeling that characterize our inner lives. The piano's design continued evolving through the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Makers extended the range of the keyboard, adding more octaves in both directions. They experimented with string thickness and tension, seeking greater volume and richer tone. The addition of the sustaining pedal, which lifts all the dampers simultaneously, created a new dimension of sound, allowing notes to blend and reverberate together in ways that opened fresh harmonic possibilities. A second pedal, the soft pedal, offered yet another gradation of tone color. The iron frame, which began appearing in the early 1800s, represented another crucial advance. Earlier pianos had wooden frames that could only support limited string tension. Iron frames allowed builders to string the instruments much more tightly, producing greater volume and sustaining power. This was particularly important as concert halls grew larger and composers sought instruments that could fill these expanding spaces with sound. The piano was gradually transforming from an intimate chamber instrument into something capable of commanding a full orchestra's attention. By the time Beethoven reached his mature compositional period, the piano had become the vehicle for some of music's most profound expressions. His later sonatas pushed the instrument to its limits, demanding a range of nearly 7 octaves and dynamics from barely audible whispers to shattering fortissimos. He wrote passages that seemed to make the piano sing, and others that unleash its percussive power in ways that earlier generations could never have imagined. The instrument's expressive range had grown to match the expanding emotional ambitions of the age. The piano's versatility meant it became both a solo instrument and an essential component of chamber music. It could accompany singers with sensitivity, hold its own against string quartets, and stand alone in recitals. In homes across Europe and eventually America, pianos became centers of domestic music making, instruments on which amateurs could play simplified versions of symphonies and operas, where families could gather to sing, where young people could develop their musical understanding. The piano democratized music in ways that orchestral instruments never could, bringing complex compositions into private spaces. As we move forward into the classical period proper, we'll find the piano at the heart of musical development, an instrument whose evolution both reflected and drove the changing aesthetics of composition, an invention whose perfect marriage of mechanical ingenuity and expressive possibility continues to shape music even in our own time. As the piano's hammer mechanism was still finding its way into drawing rooms and concert halls across Europe, a new spirit of clarity and proportion began to settle over the musical world. The ornate complexities of the Baroque era, with its cascading embellishments and mathematical intricacies, gradually gave way to something more balanced, more approachable, more concerned with elegant structures that any educated listener could appreciate and understand. This transformation didn't happen overnight. In the middle decades of the 18th century, composers began to favor melodies that sang clearly above their accompaniments, rather than the interweaving lines of counterpoint that had dominated for generations. They sought forms that satisfied the mind's desire for symmetry and resolution, creating musical architectures as graceful and proportioned as the neoclassical buildings rising in cities throughout Europe. The symphony emerged as the pinnacle of this new aesthetic. Born from the Italian opera overture, this instrumental form expanded into a multi-movement journey that could express a complete range of moods and ideas without a single word being sung. Early symphonies were modest affairs, often scored for just a handful of instruments, but they contained the seeds of something grand. They typically followed a clear structure, a lively opening movement, a slower and more contemplative second movement, a graceful dance-like third movement, and a spirited finale that sent audiences home with energy in their step. Joseph Haydn, working in relative isolation at the Esterházy court in Hungary, became the primary architect of the symphony's mature form. Over decades of patient experimentation, writing symphony after symphony for his patron's private orchestra, he discovered what worked and what didn't. He learned how to balance surprise with expectation, how to develop a simple musical idea into an extended argument that held listeners' attention, how to create drama and resolution through the careful management of harmony and melody. Haydn wrote over 100 symphonies during his long career, each one a laboratory for new ideas. He discovered that audiences delighted in clever twists, a sudden silence where sound was expected, a quiet passage that erupted into fortissimo energy, a simple folk-like melody that revealed unexpected depths. His music spoke with wit and charm, conversational rather than commanding, inviting rather than overwhelming. When he finally traveled to London late in his life, the symphonies he wrote for those concerts represented the culmination of everything he had learned, works of such assurance and mastery that they seemed inevitable, as though they had always existed and were merely waiting to be discovered. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart brought to this classical style a quality of effortless beauty that has never been equaled. Where Haydn was patient and methodical, Mozart seemed to compose with the ease of breathing. His melodies possessed a naturalness that made them feel like they had grown organically rather than being constructed note by note. His last symphonies, written in a remarkable burst of creativity, demonstrated how the form could encompass everything from gentle grace to dramatic urgency, from playfulness to profound depth. Mozart's ability to work across all musical genres, opera, symphony, concerto, chamber music, sacred music, allowed him to bring insights from each world into the others. His piano concertos transformed the relationship between soloist and orchestra from one of simple contrast to a kind of ongoing conversation, sometimes agreeing, sometimes challenging, always maintaining perfect balance. The orchestra would present an idea, the piano would reflect on it, elaborate it, transform it, and offer it back changed but recognizable. The classical style that Haydn and Mozart perfected rested on principles that audiences found deeply satisfying. Melodies were constructed in balanced phrases, often in groups of 4 measures, creating a sense of question and answer, tension and release. Harmonies moved through predictable but pleasing progressions, establishing a home key, venturing into related territories, and returning home with a sense of completion. The forms themselves, sonata form in particular, created expectations that composers could fulfill, delay, or cleverly subvert, always maintaining the listener's engagement through a carefully calibrated balance of familiarity and surprise. This was music that respected its listener's intelligence while remaining accessible to anyone with attentive ears. It didn't require specialized knowledge to appreciate, though deeper understanding certainly enriched the experience. The structures were clear enough that even a first-time listener could sense when a theme was returning, when a development section was exploring new territory, when the music was building toward its conclusion. The string quartet emerged during this period as an intimate counterpart to the symphony, 4 instruments creating a perfect democracy of sound. 2 violins, a viola, and a cello could achieve remarkable variety of texture and expression while maintaining a transparency that allowed listeners to hear every voice clearly. Haydn again pioneered the form, discovering over dozens of quartets how these 4 instruments could converse like thoughtful friends, each voice important, each contributing to the whole. Public concerts became increasingly common during this era, moving music beyond the courts and churches that had previously been its primary homes. The rising merchant class wanted access to the cultural refinements once reserved for nobility, and composers found they could make their livings serving this broader audience. Music became a social occasion, a gathering of the community to experience beauty together in elegant concert halls built specifically for the purpose. Ludwig van Beethoven arrived in Vienna just as Mozart's life was ending, carrying with him the classical forms that Haydn and Mozart had perfected. His early symphonies and chamber works showed complete mastery of these structures, demonstrating that he understood the rules thoroughly. But even in these works, there were hints of something more personal, more urgent, more willing to push against boundaries. As the 18th century drew to a close and the 19th century dawned, Beethoven stood at a threshold. The balanced proportions and elegant clarity of the classical era had reached their apex. The forms had been perfected, the possibilities seemingly exhausted. But Beethoven, struggling with growing deafness, increasingly isolated from the world of sound, even as he created sound for others, began to hear something different, something more emotionally direct, more individual, more willing to break rules in service of expression. The classical period had given music structures strong enough to contain any idea, forms flexible enough to express any mood while maintaining coherence and balance. These achievements wouldn't be discarded, but they would be transformed, expanded, pushed to their limits and beyond. The symphony that Haydn had patiently constructed and Mozart had filled with effortless beauty was about to become, in Beethoven's hands, a vehicle for a more personal, more dramatic, more emotionally unbounded kind of expression. The age of classical balance was preparing to give way to romantic passion, though the foundations laid during these decades would support everything that followed. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, something profound began to shift in the hearts of composers across Europe. The balanced symmetry and elegant restraint that had defined the classical era started to feel, to some musicians, like a beautiful cage. The rules that Haydn and Mozart had perfected were not broken carelessly, but rather stretched and expanded by artists who felt music should do more than please the ear with graceful proportion. They wanted music to stir the soul, to express the depths of human emotion in ways that words alone could never capture. Beethoven stood at the threshold of this transformation, one foot still planted in the classical world of his teacher Haydn, the other stepping boldly into uncharted territory. His third symphony, composed in 1804, announced something new was happening. Where symphonies had once been elegant entertainments, this work was nearly twice as long as expected, filled with stormy conflicts and triumphant resolutions that seemed to mirror the struggles of human existence itself. The funeral march, in its second movement, stretched for nearly 20 minutes, a meditation on mortality so profound that listeners left concert halls shaken and transformed. This was the dawning of the Romantic era in music, a period that would dominate the 19th century and expand the emotional vocabulary of organized sound in ways the ancient Greeks, who first theorized about harmony, could never have imagined. The Romantic composers were not content to work within established forms. They wanted music to tell stories, to paint pictures, to express feelings so specific and personal that each composition became a window into an individual human soul. Poland gave the world Frédéric Chopin, whose nocturnes and mazurkas captured something essentially poetic about the piano. His music often felt intimate, as though he was sharing secrets in a candlelit salon rather than performing for crowds. Each phrase breathed like natural speech, pausing and accelerating with human spontaneity. Chopin discovered that the piano, that marvel of engineering from the previous century, could sing with a voice as expressive as any human vocalist. His music for the instrument explored textures from the most delicate whispers to passionate declarations, often within the span of a few measures. In Germany, Robert Schumann approached composition as though writing in a musical diary, pouring out his inner life in works with evocative titles like Scenes from Childhood and Kreisleriana. He and his wife, Clara, herself a brilliant pianist and composer, represented a new kind of musical partnership where personal feeling and artistic expression intertwined completely. Schumann's music often shifted moods rapidly, capturing the changeability of human emotion with a directness that would have seemed improper to an earlier generation. The Romantic composers discovered that music could be explicitly about something beyond itself. Franz Liszt pioneered what came to be called program music, compositions that told specific stories or described particular scenes. His symphonic poems depicted everything from Prometheus to the sounds of a Hungarian battlefield. Hector Berlioz took this further with his Symphonie Fantastique, a five-movement journey through an artist's obsessive love, complete with a dream sequence, a pastoral scene, a march to the scaffold, and a witch's sabbath. The symphony as abstract form became a symphony as narrative experience. Nationalism stirred in the hearts of Romantic composers as political movements swept across Europe. Composers from regions outside the traditional centers of musical power in Germany, Austria, and Italy began deliberately incorporating the folk melodies, dances, and rhythmic patterns of their homelands into concert music. This was partly artistic and partly political, a way of asserting cultural identity through sound. Bedřich Smetana in Bohemia composed the Moldau, tracing the journey of a river through the Czech countryside with music that evoked folk dances and pastoral scenes. Edvard Grieg in Norway wove the modal scales and rhythms of Norwegian folk music into his concert works. In Russia, Mikhail Glinka and later Modest Mussorgsky, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, and Alexander Borodin created a distinctly Russian sound, building from Orthodox church music and peasant songs rather than Western European models. Russia also produced Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, whose ballet scores and symphonies married emotional intensity with memorable melodies that could break a listener's heart. His Swan Lake, The Nutcracker, and Sleeping Beauty elevated ballet music from mere accompaniment to fully realized symphonic achievement. His later symphonies, particularly the sixth, known as the Pathétique, plumbed depths of melancholy and resignation that felt startlingly personal, as though the composer were sharing his most private sorrows. The Romantic era also witnessed the rise of the virtuoso performer as a kind of hero. Niccolò Paganini's violin playing seemed so impossibly difficult that rumors circulated he had made a pact with supernatural forces. Liszt at the piano could reduce audiences to tears or whip them into frenzies, and he understood himself to be not just a performer, but a creative artist whose interpretations were themselves acts of composition. The concert hall became a space where individual genius was celebrated, where audiences came not just to hear music, but to witness extraordinary human achievement. This was the era when composers began writing music that was sometimes almost unplayable, pushing the technical boundaries of instruments and performers to new extremes. Chopin's etudes were not just exercises, but concert pieces that demanded finger independence and speed that seemed barely human. Liszt's transcriptions of Paganini's violin works for piano created cascades of notes that required hands to stretch across vast reaches of the keyboard. The Romantic composers expanded orchestras as well, adding instruments and creating ever larger ensembles capable of tremendous dynamic range, from the softest whisper to overwhelming power. They explored the unique colors of each instrument, giving solo moments to the English horn, the French horn, the clarinet, discovering that each had its own character and emotional quality. As the 19th century progressed, harmony itself became more complex and ambiguous. Composers like Wagner began pushing toward a harmonic language where the clear resolution and tonal certainty of earlier music started to dissolve. Chords hung suspended, neither clearly major nor minor, creating feelings of yearning and irresolution that perfectly matched the Romantic fascination with longing and the unattainable. Through all these developments, the Romantic era fundamentally changed what music was expected to do. No longer merely beautiful patterns of sound, music became a language of emotion, a way of expressing the inexpressible, of capturing feelings too subtle or too powerful for words. Each composer's voice became distinct, recognizable, personal. And yet, for all this individualism and breaking of rules, the Romantic composers still worked within the tradition of Western classical music, building on the foundations laid by their predecessors, even as they expanded the possibilities of what music could mean and feel. While the concert halls of Europe echoed with the passionate works of Romantic composers, other musical worlds continued their own ancient journeys, often unnoticed by those who chronicled the classical tradition. These parallel rivers of sound had flowed for centuries, some for millennia, carrying their own sophisticated systems of rhythm, melody, and meaning. They represented not alternatives to the European classical tradition, but entirely independent discoveries of what music could be and do. In the villages and towns of West Africa, musical traditions had evolved that treated rhythm with a complexity European music would not approach until the 20th century. The djembe drum, carved from a single piece of wood and covered with goatskin, could produce an astonishing range of tones depending on where and how the drummer struck its surface. But the true sophistication lay not in individual instruments, but in how multiple drums would interact, creating polyrhythmic patterns where 3 beats might dance against 4 and 5 against both, all simultaneously weaving a tapestry of interlocking rhythms that seemed impossibly complex, yet felt entirely natural to those who grew up within this musical language. The talking drums of West Africa took this relationship with rhythm even further, using the tonal nature of languages like Yoruba and Akan to actually communicate verbal messages through drum beats. By varying the tension on the drumhead with an arm while striking with the other hand, skilled drummers could approximate the pitch contours of speech, sending news and proverbs across distances long before any electronic communication existed. Music and language here were not separate realms, but intimately connected expressions of the same fundamental human need to convey meaning through organized sound. Moving northward across the Mediterranean, the musical traditions of the Middle East and North Africa developed their own sophisticated systems that would sound foreign to ears trained only in European harmony. The concept of the makam provided a framework entirely different from Western major and minor scales. Each makam was more than just a sequence of notes. It was a complete musical world with its own character, its own emotional associations, and its own rules about which melodic phrases were appropriate and which would sound wrong to educated listeners. A musician trained in this tradition would spend years mastering not just technique, but the deep aesthetic knowledge of when and how to use each makam. The oud, a pear-shaped stringed instrument that would eventually travel to Europe and evolve into the lute, sat at the heart of much Middle Eastern music. Its fretless neck allowed for the subtle microtones that gave this music its distinctive character, notes that fell between the fixed pitches of a piano keyboard. When combined with the haunting sound of the ney flute and the intricate patterns of the darbuka drum, these instruments created music of mesmerizing complexity, often improvised within the frameworks that tradition provided. In the green hills and coastal lands where Celtic peoples settled, music took on different qualities suited to different needs. Ballads told stories that preserved history and legend through generations when few could read or write. The harp, which had existed in Ireland since at least the 10th century, became a symbol of cultural identity, its ringing strings accompanying tales of heroes and heartbreak. The fiddle, adopted from classical traditions but transformed by local techniques and repertoires, could make people dance or weep, sometimes in the same evening. These were not simple folk melodies, but sophisticated musical traditions with their own ornamental techniques and modal systems that predated the major-minor system that would later dominate European music. The Sean Nos singing tradition of Ireland demonstrated how the human voice alone, without any instrumental accompaniment, could create music of profound depth. Singers would ornament melodies with subtle variations, their voices sliding between notes in ways that reflected an aesthetic entirely different from the trained operatic voices filling concert halls elsewhere. The song was not performed. It was inhabited, lived through, with each performance a unique realization of a melody that belonged to the community rather than to any individual composer. Across the Atlantic, the musical traditions of indigenous peoples in the Americas had developed in complete isolation from Old World influences. The Andean peoples of South America crafted panpipes called zamponias from hollow reeds, each pipe producing a single note, with musicians playing in pairs or groups to create complete melodies. The haunting sound of these instruments, played at high altitudes where the thin air gave them a unique quality, accompanied ceremonies and daily life alike. Drums, rattles, and flutes made from bone or wood created rhythmic and melodic patterns tied to specific dances, ceremonies, and seasons. In what would become Mexico and Central America, musical traditions incorporated large ensembles of percussion instruments, including drums of various sizes, scrapers made from gourds, and whistles that could produce remarkably pure tones. The complex civilizations that rose and fell in these regions left evidence of sophisticated musical practices, though much of the specific knowledge of how this music sounded was lost to time and conquest. The African diaspora would eventually carry West African musical traditions across the ocean under the most tragic circumstances, but those traditions proved remarkably resilient. In the Caribbean, they would blend with European and indigenous influences to create entirely new forms. The steel pan drums of Trinidad, crafted from oil barrels and tuned to produce distinct pitches, would not emerge until the 20th century, but they represented a continuation of the African tradition of innovation with percussion instruments. In Cuba, complex polyrhythmic patterns would merge with Spanish melodic traditions to create son and later salsa, while the religious traditions of Santeria preserved African rhythms within new contexts. The flamenco tradition of southern Spain represented another kind of cultural fusion, blending influences from Romani peoples, Moorish musical traditions, and Spanish folk music into something entirely its own. The passionate vocals, the intricate footwork, and the hypnotic guitar accompaniment created an art form that was simultaneously ancient and constantly renewing itself with each performance. Like jazz would later do, flamenco treated tradition as a foundation for individual expression rather than a rigid set of rules to be followed. These musical traditions shared certain characteristics despite their geographic and cultural distances from one another. They were primarily oral traditions, passed from generation to generation through demonstration and practice rather than written notation. They were often communal rather than performance-based, with the line between musician and audience more fluid than in concert hall settings. They frequently served social functions beyond pure entertainment, marking life transitions, celebrating harvests, mourning losses, or invoking spiritual presence. What they offered was proof that music was not a single path of development leading inevitably to the symphony orchestra, but rather a garden of infinite variety where different cultures had cultivated different flowers. Each tradition had discovered its own truths about what organized sound could accomplish and what it could mean to human communities. These were not preliminary stages waiting to evolve into something more sophisticated, but complete musical systems in themselves, refined over centuries to serve the specific needs and express the specific spirits of the peoples who created them. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, these separate streams would begin to flow together in new ways, but that convergence still lay ahead, waiting for technologies and social changes not yet imagined. Having journeyed through the world's diverse musical traditions, from the intricate polyrhythms of West Africa to the haunting melodies of the Middle East, we now turn our attention to something equally wondrous yet invisible. What is music, really, when we strip away the cultural meanings and emotional associations? What travels through the air from instrument to ear, and why do certain combinations of vibrations create pleasure while others create dissonance? The answer lies in the nature of sound itself, in the elegant physics that governs every note ever played, every song ever sung. Understanding these principles reveals why a Stradivarius violin sounds different from a student instrument, why a flute has such a pure tone, and why a perfectly tuned chord can make the hairs stand up on your arms. Sound begins with movement. When a guitar string vibrates, it pushes against the air molecules around it, creating regions of higher and lower pressure that spread outward like ripples on a pond. These pressure waves travel through the air at approximately 343 meters per second at room temperature, a speed that varies slightly with humidity and air pressure. The waves themselves are simply air molecules bumping into their neighbors in sequence, passing energy along without the molecules themselves traveling very far at all. The number of times these waves cycle each second determines what we perceive as pitch. We measure this in hertz, named for the 19th century physicist Heinrich Hertz. A sound vibrating at 440 cycles per second, or 440 hertz, produces the note that orchestras tune to, the A above middle C double that frequency to 880 hertz, and you hear the same note one octave higher. Halve it to 220 hertz, and the note drops an octave lower. This mathematical relationship, this elegant doubling and halving, underlies every musical scale humans have ever devised. The human ear can detect frequencies from roughly 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, though this range narrows with age. The deepest notes on a pipe organ rumble at the very bottom of this range, felt in the chest as much as heard. The highest overtones of a violin shimmer at the upper limits of perception, adding brilliance to the tone without necessarily being consciously heard as separate pitches. But frequency alone does not tell the whole story of sound. The loudness or softness of a sound relates to amplitude, the height of those pressure waves. Larger vibrations create taller waves, which we experience as greater volume. Scientists measure sound intensity in decibels, a logarithmic scale where a whisper might register at 20 decibels, normal conversation at 60, and a rock concert at 120. The logarithmic nature means that a sound just 10 decibels louder represents roughly twice the perceived loudness and requires 10 times the actual acoustic power. Yet even knowing the frequency and amplitude of a sound does not fully describe what we hear. Play middle C on a piano and then play the same note on a flute. Both vibrate at approximately 262 hertz. Both might be played at the same volume, yet they sound completely different. This quality that distinguishes one instrument from another we call timbre, sometimes described as the color or texture of sound. Timbre arises from overtones, also called harmonics or partials. When you pluck a guitar string, the entire string vibrates at its fundamental frequency, producing the note you hear most clearly. But the string simultaneously vibrates in halves, thirds, quarters, and smaller divisions, each producing a higher frequency that blends with the fundamental. These overtones stack up mathematically at frequencies that are whole number multiples of the fundamental. A note at 100 Hz produces overtones at 200, 300, 400, 500 Hz and beyond, growing progressively quieter as the numbers climb. Different instruments emphasize different overtones in their unique patterns. A clarinet, because of its cylindrical bore and the way the air column vibrates within it, produces odd-numbered harmonics much more strongly than even-numbered ones, giving it that distinctive woody, hollow quality. A trumpet, with its brass material and conical flair, emphasizes different harmonics, creating its bright, brassy character. The human voice generates incredibly complex patterns of overtones that shift constantly, which is why even sophisticated synthesizers struggled for decades to create convincing vocal sounds. The concept of resonance helps explain why certain materials and shapes produce particular timbres. Resonance occurs when an object vibrates most readily at specific frequencies. A wine glass has a natural resonant frequency determined by its size, shape, and thickness. Sing that particular pitch near the glass, and it will begin to vibrate in sympathy, potentially even shattering if enough energy is applied at precisely the right frequency. Musical instruments are essentially resonance machines, carefully designed to emphasize desirable frequencies and suppress unwanted ones. The wooden body of a violin resonates with the vibrating strings, amplifying the sound and filtering it through the particular resonant properties of spruce and maple wood carefully carved to specific thicknesses. The legendary violin makers of Cremona, Italy, might not have understood the physics in modern terms, but through careful experimentation and apprenticeship, they learned to shape wood to achieve the most beautiful resonance. The column of air inside a flute resonates at different frequencies depending on which holes remain covered, effectively changing the length of the vibrating air column. A longer column produces a lower pitch, a shorter column a higher pitch. The same principle governs all wind instruments, from the piccolo to the massive pipes of a cathedral organ. The mathematics remain consistent even as the scale changes from a few inches to 30 feet or more. Even the concert hall itself acts as a resonant chamber, shaped to enhance certain frequencies while controlling others. Architects and acousticians spend careers studying how sound reflects off walls, absorbs into fabrics, and diffracts around columns and balconies. The ideal reverberation time, the length a sound continues to bounce around a space before fading away, depends on the music being performed. A chamber music recital benefits from shorter reverberation, allowing rapid notes to remain distinct. A symphony orchestra sounds most glorious with longer reverberation that blends the instruments into a cohesive whole. The phenomenon of beats demonstrates how waves interact with one another. Play two notes that are close but not identical in pitch, perhaps 440 and 442 Hz, and you hear a wavering, a pulsing quality. This occurs because the waves alternately reinforce and cancel each other as they drift in and out of phase. The rate of this wavering equals the difference between the frequencies, in this case 2 beats per second. Piano tuners use this principle, listening for beats to disappear as they bring strings into perfect unison. Understanding consonance and dissonance also requires examining the relationships between frequencies. Notes whose frequencies relate by simple whole number ratios tend to sound pleasant together. An octave represents a ratio of 2 to 1. A perfect fifth, the interval from C to G, represents a ratio of 3 to 2. These simple ratios mean the overtones of both notes align more frequently, creating less conflict, less roughness in the combined sound. More complex ratios produce dissonance, though cultural conditioning plays a substantial role in what sounds acceptable. Medieval listeners found thirds dissonant, though modern ears hear them as sweet consonances. The science of sound waves reveals that music, for all its emotional power and cultural significance, ultimately obeys the same physical laws that govern everything in our universe. Yet somehow these vibrating air molecules, these mathematical ratios and resonant frequencies become something transcendent. The physics explains the mechanism, but not the magic, the how, but perhaps not the why. As we drift towards sleep, we might marvel that something as simple as organized vibration can carry such meaning, connect us across cultures and centuries, and move us to tears or joy. The world of sound had been understood through physics and mathematics, but until the late 19th century, music remained as ephemeral as breath itself. Once a performance ended, the sound vanished into silence, leaving only memories and the hope that skilled musicians might recreate the experience another day. This fundamental truth about music was about to change in ways that would reshape human culture forever. On a winter day in 1877, Thomas Edison sat in his laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, working on improvements to the telegraph and telephone. While experimenting with a device that could record telegraph messages, he had an unexpected realization. If vibrations from sound could be captured as indentations on a moving surface, perhaps those indentations could then recreate the original sound. He sketched a simple machine, a cylinder wrapped in tin foil, rotated by a hand crank with a needle attached to a diaphragm that would both record and play back sound vibrations. The first phonograph was constructed quickly, and Edison tested it by reciting "Mary Had a Little Lamb" into the recording horn while turning the crank. When he repositioned the needle and turned the crank again, his own voice emerged from the machine, tinny and faint, but unmistakable. The people present in the laboratory that day witnessed something no human had ever experienced before. Sound freed from the moment of its creation, captured and preserved like a photograph captures light. The initial phonograph was primitive, and the tin foil cylinders wore out after just a few plays. The sound quality was poor, filled with scratches and surface noise, yet the principle had been established. For the first time in human history, a performance could be bottled, stored, and experienced again whenever desired. Musicians who had spent lifetimes developing techniques passed down through careful teaching could now simply demonstrate their art, and that demonstration could outlive them by generations. Emil Berliner improved upon Edison's design in the late 1880s by replacing the cylinder with a flat disc and using a lateral cutting method rather than vertical. These disc recordings, which he called gramophone records, could be manufactured in multiple copies from a single master recording. This manufacturing capability meant that a single performance could reach thousands of listeners, not just those fortunate enough to attend a concert or own one of Edison's delicate cylinder recordings. The early recording industry faced significant technical limitations. Acoustic recording, which relied entirely on sound waves themselves to move the recording needle, required musicians to crowd around large horns that funneled sound toward the recording apparatus. Large orchestras had to be reduced to small ensembles. Singers had to project with extraordinary force. Quiet instruments like the violin often failed to register adequately, while loud instruments like the tuba and trumpet dominated. Recording sessions became exercises in compromises and careful positioning. Despite these constraints, musicians and audiences embraced the new technology with enthusiasm. Opera singers became the first recording stars, their voices preserved for posterity. Enrico Caruso, the great Italian tenor, made hundreds of recordings between 1902 and 1920, and these records sold in astonishing numbers. Suddenly, people who had never attended an opera could experience the power of a trained operatic voice in their own homes. Music was no longer bound by geography or economic access. The introduction of electrical recording in the mid-1920s transformed the quality of captured sound. Microphones replaced acoustic horns, converting sound waves into electrical signals that could be amplified before cutting the master disc. This electrical process captured a much wider range of frequencies and dynamics. Orchestras could play at natural volumes. Quiet instruments became audible. The hiss and limited frequency response of acoustic recordings gave way to something that began to sound genuinely lifelike. Recording technology changed not just how people listened to music, but how musicians thought about performance. Before recordings, each concert was unique and temporary. Musicians developed styles suited to live performance in particular acoustic spaces, but recordings demanded consistency and perfection. A mistake that might pass unnoticed in the flow of a live concert became permanent on a record that listeners would hear repeatedly. Musicians began to approach recording sessions differently than concerts, aiming for a polished permanence rather than the spontaneous energy of live performance. The very nature of musical composition began to shift as well. Composers could now hear exactly how their works would sound under different interpretations. They could study recordings of performances, analyzing details that would have been impossible to catch in the fleeting moment of live music. Some composers began creating works specifically with recording in mind, thinking about how their music would sound in the intimate setting of home listening rather than the grand space of a concert hall. Magnetic tape recording, developed in Germany during the 1930s and refined during the following decades, brought another revolution. Unlike disc recordings that captured a performance in one continuous take, tape could be edited. Performances could be assembled from multiple takes, choosing the best version of each passage. Mistakes could be removed. Different sections could be spliced together. The recorded performance became something that might never have existed as a single continuous event, an idealized version assembled from fragments of reality. This editing capability raised new questions about authenticity and artistry. Was a heavily edited recording still a true performance, or had it become something else entirely, a constructed artifact? Musicians held different views. Some embraced the ability to create perfect recordings impossible in live performance. Others felt that editing removed the human spontaneity that gave music its vitality. These debates continued throughout the 20th century and persist today in different forms. Recording technology also preserved musical traditions that might otherwise have vanished. Ethnomusicologists traveled to remote regions with portable recording equipment, capturing folk songs, tribal chants, and traditional instruments before these cultural expressions disappeared. These field recordings became archives of human cultural diversity, documenting ways of making music that industrial civilization was rapidly transforming or erasing. The economics of music shifted fundamentally as recordings became a commercial product. Musicians could now earn income from recorded performances sold to thousands or millions of listeners, not just from live concerts. Record companies emerged as powerful forces in musical culture, deciding which artists to record and promote. The relationship between musician and audience gained a new intermediary, with all the complexities that entailed. As the technology improved through the 20th century, moving from shellac 78 RPM discs to vinyl long-playing records, From monophonic to stereophonic sound, from analog to digital, each advancement brought recorded sound closer to the lived experience of music. Yet something always remained different between a recording and a live performance, a quality that technology could approach but never quite capture. Perhaps it was the shared presence of musician and listener in the same space, the subtle variations that make each performance unique, or simply the knowledge that what you hear is happening now, not preserved from another time. Recording technology had transformed music from something that existed only in moments of performance into something that could be possessed, collected, and consumed at will. This transformation would set the stage for everything that followed in modern musical culture, as the barriers between performer and listener continued to dissolve in unexpected ways. As the 20th century dawned and recording technology began capturing music for posterity, something remarkable was taking shape in the American South, particularly in and around New Orleans, Louisiana. In the streets, dance halls, and gathering places of African American communities, musicians were creating something entirely new, something that would transform music across the entire world. They called it jazz, and it represented one of humanity's great creative innovations. The roots of this new music ran deep into history. Enslaved Africans had brought with them complex rhythmic traditions, polyrhythms where multiple patterns interweave and dance around each other. They had brought call and response singing, work songs, and a way of bending notes that gave melodies an emotional depth European scales couldn't quite capture. After emancipation, these musical traditions blended with European harmonies, the instruments of military bands, the structure of hymns sung in churches, and the 12-bar blues that had emerged from the cotton fields and river towns. In New Orleans, with its unique cultural mixture of French, Spanish, Caribbean, and American influences, all these elements came together in a musical melting pot. The city itself seemed designed for music. Funeral processions featured brass bands that played solemn dirges on the way to the cemetery, then broke into joyous celebration on the return, a tradition that captured something essential about jazz from the beginning. Life and sorrow and joy all mixed together. Music was everywhere, from the dance halls of Storyville to Congo Square, where people had gathered for generations to make music and dance. What made jazz revolutionary was improvisation. While European classical music had largely moved away from spontaneous creation by the 19th century, jazz placed it at the very center. A musician would take a melody, a set of chord changes, and create something new in the moment, responding to the other players, to the audience, to some in a creative impulse. It was composition happening in real time, and it required both deep musical knowledge and the courage to take risks. Early jazz musicians like Buddy Bolden, whose cornet playing became legendary, though sadly no recordings of him survive, created the template. Charles Buddy Bolden could play so loud his sound carried for miles on a clear night, or so the stories went. He played with power and emotion that drew crowds wherever he performed in the early 1900s. But it was Louis Armstrong, born in New Orleans in 1901, who would show the world what jazz could truly be. Armstrong transformed the trumpet into a vehicle for pure musical expression. His technical virtuosity was breathtaking, but more importantly, he understood that every note should tell a story, should carry feeling. His improvised solos had the logic and beauty of composed pieces, yet they sparkled with spontaneity. When he began singing as well, his gravelly voice brought the same warmth and inventiveness he displayed on his instrument. Armstrong's recordings from the 1920s with his Hot 5 and Hot 7 groups remain some of the most important documents in jazz history, capturing the moment when individual expression became as important as ensemble playing. Jazz spread rapidly. The Great Migration, when millions of African Americans moved from the South to northern cities seeking opportunity and escape from oppression, carried the music to Chicago, Kansas City, New York, and beyond. In each city, the music evolved, taking on local characteristics. Chicago jazz had an edge of urban energy. Kansas City developed a blues-inflected style built on riffs and extended improvisation. By the 1930s and 40s, jazz had evolved into swing, and it became America's popular music. Big bands led by Duke Ellington, Count Basie, and Benny Goodman filled dance halls. Duke Ellington, a sophisticated composer and bandleader, demonstrated that jazz could be as complex and carefully crafted as any classical composition, while maintaining its essential spontaneity and emotional directness. His orchestra became his instrument, and he wrote pieces that showcased the unique voices of his musicians, creating a rich, layered sound that could be both elegant and deeply soulful. The swing era brought jazz to the mainstream, but some musicians felt the music was losing its improvisational edge, becoming too arranged and predictable. In the early 1940s, in after-hours clubs in Harlem, a new revolution was brewing. Young musicians like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Thelonious Monk were reimagining what jazz could be. They called it bebop, and it was faster, more complex, built on intricate chord progressions and lightning-fast improvisation that demanded complete mastery of the instrument. Charlie Parker, playing alto saxophone, could spin out phrases of dazzling complexity at breakneck speed, yet every note seemed perfectly placed, inevitable. Bebop wasn't dance music anymore. It was music for focused listening, where the improvisation itself became the point. The harmonies grew more sophisticated, incorporating extensions and alterations that classical composers had only recently begun exploring. Jazz continued evolving through the decades that followed. Cool jazz in the 1950s brought a more relaxed, subtle approach. Hard bop reintroduced blues and gospel influences. Modal jazz, pioneered by Miles Davis and others, moved away from complex chord changes toward improvisation based on scales or modes, creating a more spacious, meditative sound. Free jazz in the 1960s questioned all the rules, exploring what music could be when even the basic structures were abandoned. What remained constant through all these transformations was jazz's essential spirit, that combination of deep tradition and individual freedom, of technical mastery and emotional truth. Jazz taught the world that music could be both disciplined and spontaneous, that the moment of creation could be as important as what was created, that conversation between musicians could generate beauty more profound than any single voice alone. And jazz's influence spread far beyond its own boundaries. The music touched everything that came after, from rock and roll to hip-hop, from Brazilian bossa nova to European art music. It demonstrated that American vernacular music could achieve the same artistic heights as the European classical tradition. It showed that music rooted in African American experience could speak to the entire world. As we move forward in our story toward the electronic instruments and global fusions that would define the later 20th century, we carry with us jazz's revolutionary lesson. That freedom and structure, tradition and innovation need not oppose each other, but can instead create something greater than either could alone. As jazz musicians, we're exploring the outer boundaries of improvisation and harmonic experimentation. Inventors and composers in laboratories and workshops were pursuing an entirely different frontier. They were asking a question that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. What if music could be created not from vibrating strings, resonating wood, or blown air, but from electricity itself? The story of electronic instruments begins, surprisingly, in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. In 1920, a young Soviet physicist named Lev Sergeyevich Termen was working on proximity sensors when he noticed that his body's position near the electromagnetic field of his equipment affected the pitch of the audio frequency it produced. Rather than dismissing this as interference, Termen recognized something musical in this phenomenon. He refined his device, creating an instrument that could be played without physical contact, simply by moving one's hands through the air around two antennas. When he demonstrated his invention for Lenin, the Soviet leader was so captivated that he learned to play it himself. Termen would later bring his invention to America, where his name was anglicized to theremin, and the instrument took the same name. The theremin produced an eerie, wavering tone unlike anything heard from traditional instruments. Its sound was ethereal and otherworldly, created purely by the heterodyning of two radio frequencies. One hand controlled pitch by proximity to a vertical antenna, while the other controlled volume near a horizontal loop. Mastering the instrument required extraordinary precision and control, as there were no physical guides, no keys or strings or frets to indicate where notes resided in the invisible field. Yet in the hands of skilled performers like Clara Rockmore, the theremin could sing with surprising expressiveness, its swooping glissandos creating melodies that seemed to float in space. While the theremin remained something of a novelty, it opened minds to the possibility that sound could be generated electronically rather than mechanically. In France, during the late 1920s, Maurice Martenot developed the Ons Martenot, an electronic instrument that used similar principles to the theremin, but added a keyboard interface and a ring worn on the player's finger that slid along a wire. The Ons Martenot produced a similarly haunting tone, but with greater precision in pitch. Composers, including Olivier Messiaen, would write serious concert works for the instrument, recognizing that its unique timbre could express things that traditional instruments could not. The 1930s and 40s saw other experiments with electronic tone generation. The Hammond organ, invented by Lawrence Hammond in 1934, used rotating tone wheels next to electromagnetic pickups to generate sounds approximating pipe organs. Though not designed to create entirely new sounds, the Hammond organ's mechanical-electrical hybrid approach produced a distinctive character all its own, particularly when played through a rotating speaker cabinet. The instrument would find its greatest expression decades later in jazz, gospel, and rock music. After the Second World War, the pace of electronic music innovation accelerated. Magnetic tape recording, developed during wartime, gave composers the ability to manipulate sounds in ways previously impossible. In Paris, Pierre Schaeffer began experimenting with what he called musique concrète, creating compositions from recorded natural sounds that were cut, spliced, played backward, and layered. In Germany, composers at studios in Cologne were generating sounds purely electronically, using oscillators and filters to create tones that had never existed in nature. These experiments in the studios of Europe might have remained academic curiosities, but inventors were simultaneously working to make electronic sound generation practical for performers. The key breakthrough came with the development of voltage-controlled oscillators, filters, and amplifiers. By using control voltages to adjust parameters like pitch and timbre, it became possible to design instruments that could be played in real time, with keyboards and knobs offering immediate control over electronic sound. Robert Moog, a young engineer from New York with a background in theremin construction, began building modular synthesizers in the mid-1960s. His instruments consisted of separate modules, each performing a specific function: oscillators generating basic waveforms, filters shaping their harmonic content, envelope generators controlling how sounds evolved over time, and amplifiers controlling volume. These modules could be connected with patch cables in countless configurations, making each Moog synthesizer a flexible sound design instrument rather than a single fixed device. Composer Wendy Carlos demonstrated the musical potential of the Moog synthesizer with her 1968 album Switched On Batch, presenting Baroque masterpieces in shimmering electronic arrangements that became a surprise commercial success. Around the same time, Don Butchler on the West Coast was developing synthesizers with a different philosophy, favoring unpredictable, evolving sounds over the precise, keyboard-controlled approach of Moog's designs. Other inventors contributed innovations. The Mellotron used tape loops to replay recorded sounds when keys were pressed, creating orchestral textures from a keyboard. The ARP synthesizers of the early 70s offered more stable tuning and a different character than Moog's instruments. Each of these electronic instruments expanded the palette of possible sounds available to musicians. Electronic instruments did more than add new timbres. They fundamentally changed what was musically possible. With acoustic instruments, the sound is inherent in the physical object. A violin will always sound recognizably like a violin, constrained by the properties of wood, strings, and the bow's friction. But an electronic synthesizer could generate any waveform, filter it in countless ways, and shape how that sound began and ended with mathematical precision. Sounds could evolve slowly from silence or attack instantaneously. They could be bright or dark, simple or harmonically complex. They could imitate acoustic instruments or create entirely new sonic territories. As the 1970s progressed, synthesizers became more accessible and portable. Instruments like the Minimoog put synthesis controls into a compact, playable format without patch cables. String synthesizers and electric pianos gave rock and pop bands access to orchestral textures without hiring additional musicians. By the late 70s, polyphonic synthesizers that could play multiple notes simultaneously became available, making them more practical for traditional musical applications. The 1980s brought digital synthesis, using computers and microprocessors to generate and manipulate sound. The Yamaha DX7, released in 1983, used frequency modulation synthesis to create sounds with a glassy, metallic character that defined the sonic aesthetic of that decade. Samplers allowed musicians to record any sound, an acoustic instrument, a voice, a door closing, and play it back from a keyboard at any pitch. Suddenly, the distinction between synthesizer and recording became blurred. As we rest here, considering this transformation, we can appreciate how electronic instruments represented something genuinely new in music's long history. For thousands of years, every instrument had been acoustic, relying on physical objects vibrating in air. Electronic instruments freed sound from these physical constraints, making timbre itself something that could be composed and designed with as much intentionality as melody or harmony. The possibilities they created would shape the music that followed, from the ambient soundscapes to the driving rhythms of dance music, all built on the foundation of instruments that created sound from electrical current rather than vibrating air. The journey of music was entering a realm where imagination would be limited only by technology's boundaries that were expanding with each passing year. The world that emerged after the Second World War was one of tremendous energy and transformation. Young people, especially in America and Britain, were ready for something new, something that belonged to them rather than their parents. The synthesizers and electronic instruments had opened new sonic territories, but it was what happened when those technologies met traditional instruments and the raw energy of youth culture that truly changed the musical landscape forever. In the early 1950s, something remarkable was brewing in the American South. Musicians were blending the rhythms and emotional directness of blues and rhythm and blues with the energy of country music. When Elvis Presley walked into Sun's studio in Memphis in 1954 and recorded "That's All Right," the fusion created a sound that seemed to capture the restless spirit of a generation. The electric guitar, amplified to volumes that would have seemed impossibly loud just decades earlier, became the voice of this new music called rock and roll. The amplification technology that had developed during the war years now found a peacetime purpose. Electric guitars could cut through the sound of drums and bass, could be heard in large venues, and could sustain notes in ways acoustic instruments never could. Players like Chuck Berry developed a rhythmic guitar style that was both percussive and melodic, creating songs that told stories of teenage life and fast cars while making people want to dance. Across the Atlantic, British musicians were listening intently. In Liverpool, Hamburg, and London, young people absorbed American blues and rock and roll, then added their own interpretations. The Beatles emerged in the early 1960s with songs that combined infectious melodies with increasingly sophisticated studio techniques. Their producer George Martin, trained in classical music, helped them layer sounds, use unusual instruments, and think of the recording studio itself as an instrument for composition. The 1960s saw popular music become more adventurous than ever before. Recording studios developed multi-track technology, allowing musicians to layer sound upon sound, creating textures impossible in live performance. The Beach Boys' Brian Wilson used the studio to craft intricate vocal harmonies and unconventional instrument combinations. Bob Dylan brought poetic, literary lyrics to popular music, expanding what songs could express beyond simple love and dancing. As the decade progressed, rock music splintered into countless variations. Psychedelic rock experimented with unconventional song structures and sounds meant to evoke altered consciousness. Progressive rock bands incorporated elements from classical music, jazz, and world music traditions, creating extended compositions with multiple movements. Heavy metal emphasized power and volume, pushing amplification technology to create sounds that were almost physical in their intensity. Meanwhile, different forms of popular music were developing simultaneously. Soul music, emerging from gospel traditions and rhythm and blues, featured powerful vocalists like Aretha Franklin and Otis Redding expressing deep emotion over rhythms designed to move both body and spirit. Motown Records in Detroit created a distinctive sound that blended soul with pop sensibilities, producing hit after hit with carefully crafted arrangements and production. The 1970s brought disco, which transformed nightclubs into immersive musical environments. Producers like Giorgio Moroder used synthesizers and electronic drums to create propulsive dance rhythms, while string sections added lush harmonies. The emphasis shifted from live performance to studio creation, with producers becoming as important as the performers themselves. In the Bronx during the mid-1970s, young people with limited access to expensive instruments were creating something entirely new. Hip-hop culture emerged at block parties where DJs isolated and extended the rhythmic breaks in funk and soul records, creating continuous dance music. Soon, people were speaking rhythmically over these beats, an art form called rapping that drew from African American oral traditions, jazz poetry, and Caribbean toasting. Hip-hop would grow to become one of the most influential musical movements of the late 20th century, eventually spreading worldwide. Punk rock emerged simultaneously, stripping music back to raw basics. Bands in New York and London rejected the complexity and virtuosity that had come to dominate rock music, instead emphasizing energy, attitude, and directness. Three-chord songs played loudly and quickly became statements of independence and authenticity. The 1980s saw synthesizers and drum machines move from experimental tools to mainstream instruments. Bands could now create full, produced sounds with just a few people. MTV launched in 1981, adding a powerful visual dimension to popular music. Musicians now needed to think about how their music looked as well as how it sounded, and some artists like Madonna and Michael Jackson became masters of this multimedia approach. Digital recording technology began replacing analog tape in studios. Sampling technology allowed musicians to incorporate snippets of any recorded sound into new compositions, creating complex collages and sparking both creative innovations and questions about artistic ownership. Electronic dance music developed into numerous subgenres, each with devoted followers and distinct sonic characteristics. As communication technology improved, musical ideas traveled faster than ever before. A reggae rhythm from Jamaica could influence a hip-hop producer in Los Angeles, who might sample a French electronic band, creating something entirely new. World music became a recognized category as Western audiences discovered the depth and sophistication of musical traditions from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Musicians increasingly collaborated across cultural boundaries, creating fusion styles that honored multiple traditions. The 1990s and early 2000s saw the internet begin to transform how music reached audiences. File sharing and eventually streaming services meant that listeners could access almost any music imaginable. Genres continued to multiply and fragment. Subcultures formed around specific sounds, and musicians no longer needed major record labels to reach audiences worldwide. Throughout all these changes, certain fundamental elements remained constant. People still gathered to experience music together, whether at concerts, clubs, or festivals. Music still marked important life moments, celebrations, and transitions. The desire to move to rhythm, to sing together, to express emotion through organized sound continued unabated. What had changed was the speed of evolution and the interconnectedness of musical traditions. A teenager in Seoul could influence musicians in Sao Paulo. Traditional instruments from one culture could be sampled and incorporated into electronic music from another. The entire history of recorded music became simultaneously available, creating possibilities for creative combination that earlier generations could never have imagined. As the century drew to a close, popular music had become truly global, a conversation involving billions of people across every culture, each contributing their own traditions and innovations to an ever-expanding tapestry of sound. Yet underneath all this diversity, music continued to serve the same human needs it always had, connecting us to each other and to something larger than ourselves. As we settle into our exploration this evening, we turn from the instruments and genres that have filled human history towards something more mysterious and fundamental. The question of why music affects us so deeply in the first place. Why does a particular melody bring tears to our eyes? What makes a rhythm compel our bodies to move? And how does an arrangement of sounds, which serves no obvious survival purpose, reach so profoundly into our emotions and memories? The answers lie hidden within the intricate folds of the human brain, in neural pathways that light up like constellations when music begins to play. Scientists using functional magnetic resonance imaging can now watch in real time as music activates not just one region of the brain, but many areas simultaneously, creating a symphony of neural activity that few other experiences can match. When you hear a song, the auditory cortex processes the basic elements of sound, distinguishing pitch from rhythm and melody from harmony. But the experience doesn't stop there. Almost immediately, other regions join the chorus. The motor cortex engages even when you're sitting perfectly still, as your brain internally simulates the physical movements associated with creating those sounds. This is why a compelling rhythm makes it nearly impossible to keep your foot from tapping, why your body wants to move even when you consciously try to remain motionless. The emotional power of music emerges from its ability to activate the limbic system, the ancient emotional center of the brain that we share with many other mammals. When a piece of music resonates with us, the amygdala and hippocampus spring into action, connecting sounds with emotions and memories. This is why a song you haven't heard in 20 years can instantly transport you back to a specific moment in time, complete with the feelings you experienced then. Music becomes a time machine, encoded with emotional information that remains accessible across decades. Perhaps most intriguing is music's ability to trigger the release of dopamine, the same neurotransmitter associated with food, comfort, and other pleasures essential to survival. Researchers have discovered that the anticipation of a musical resolution, that moment when a melody finally reaches the note we've been waiting for, causes measurable dopamine release in the brain's reward centers. Our brains literally treat music like a reward, reinforcing our desire to seek it out and experience it again. This chemical response may explain one of music's most remarkable effects, the phenomenon of frisson, those pleasurable chills that run down your spine during a particularly moving musical moment. Studies suggest that about 2/3 of people regularly experience these musical shivers, triggered by unexpected harmonies, powerful crescendos, or the entrance of a human voice. During these moments, brain scans show activity in the same regions associated with euphoria and reward, suggesting that music can create genuine peaks of human experience. The question of why humans evolved this profound responsiveness to organized sound remains a subject of fascination and debate among scientists. Unlike language, which clearly serves communication, or tool-making, which aids survival, music's evolutionary purpose is less obvious. Some researchers suggest that music may have emerged as a social bonding mechanism, helping early human groups coordinate activities and strengthen emotional connections. When people sing or play music together, their heartbeats and breathing patterns tend to synchronize, creating a physiological unity that may have helped forge community bonds essential for survival. Others propose that music might be connected to mate selection, serving as a display of cognitive abilities, creativity, and cultural knowledge. Throughout human history, skilled musicians have often enjoyed elevated social status, and musical ability continues to be valued across virtually all cultures. The complexity required to create and perform music might signal desirable traits to potential partners, much as elaborate birdsong does in avian species. There's also evidence that music may have helped develop language itself or emerged alongside it. Infants respond to melodic patterns before they understand words, and mothers across cultures instinctively use musical prosody, singing tones in their voices when speaking to babies. This musical form of communication, sometimes called motherese, appears to be universal, suggesting deep evolutionary roots for the connection between sound patterns and emotional meaning. The relationship between rhythm and human physiology runs remarkably deep. Our hearts beat in rhythm, we breathe in rhythm, we walk in rhythm. From our earliest moments in the womb, we are surrounded by the steady percussion of our mother's heartbeat. Research has shown that rhythms close to human heart rate, typically between 60 and 90 beats per minute, tend to feel most natural and calming to us. Faster rhythms excite us, while slower rhythms can induce relaxation and even altered states of consciousness. Music's power over memory appears to be especially resilient. People with advanced Alzheimer's disease, who may not recognize their own family members, can often still sing songs they learned decades earlier. Music therapists work with these preserved musical memories to reach patients who have become isolated by cognitive decline, using familiar melodies as bridges to emotional connection and communication. The neural pathways that encode musical memories seem to be among the last to deteriorate, suggesting they occupy a particularly fundamental place in brain architecture. Cultural differences in musical preference appear to be learned rather than innate. Infants from all cultures respond similarly to consonance and dissonance, but as we grow, we become conditioned to the musical systems of our culture. Someone raised with Western harmony will find certain chord progressions satisfying that might sound strange to someone raised with different musical traditions, and vice versa. Yet beneath these learned preferences, some responses to music seem universal. Fast, rhythmic music tends to excite people everywhere, while slow, gentle melodies calm them. Major keys generally sound brighter across cultures, minor keys more somber. The social dimension of musical experience amplifies its effects considerably. Listening to music alone activates many brain regions, but making music with others creates additional neural responses related to social connection and cooperation. This may explain why humans in every known culture have created communal musical experiences, from religious ceremonies to concerts to casual singing around a fire. Music becomes a technology for generating shared emotional states, allowing groups of people to feel connected to something larger than themselves. As we rest here in the quiet, we might consider that music's power comes from its ability to speak directly to parts of our mind that exist beneath language, beyond rational thought. It reaches into ancient structures of emotion and memory, creating experiences that feel both deeply personal and universally human. From the first bone flutes played in firelight to the digital streams flowing through our modern world, music has remained a constant companion to human consciousness, a mysterious force that moves us in ways we're only beginning to understand. We find ourselves in a remarkable moment in musical history, one that would seem almost magical to those who carved bone flutes 40,000 years ago or carefully tuned bronze bells in ancient China. Today, a person sitting quietly in nearly any corner of the world can access virtually every piece of music ever recorded. The entire journey we have traveled together, from those first rhythmic patterns to the most complex symphonies, now exists in digital libraries that fit in the palm of a hand. This transformation happened with startling speed. In the year 2000, most people still bought music on compact discs from physical stores, building personal collections one album at a time. By 2010, digital downloads had become common, though each song was still individually purchased and stored. Then came the streaming revolution, beginning in earnest around 2008 with services like Spotify, which launched in Europe and gradually expanded worldwide. By 2015, the idea of owning music had begun to feel quaint to many listeners. Instead, subscription services offered access to tens of millions of recordings for the price of a single album each month. This shift changed not just how we listen, but how we discover and relate to music. Algorithms now suggest songs based on our listening habits, introducing us to artists from distant countries whose work we might never have encountered in earlier eras. A listener in Sao Paulo might discover throat singers from Mongolia. Someone in Stockholm might fall asleep to gamelan orchestras from Indonesia. The cultural boundaries that once separated musical traditions have become permeable in ways that would have taken generations of migration and cultural exchange in earlier centuries. The democratization extends to creation as well. Software like GarageBand, Ableton Live, and Logic Pro has transformed ordinary computers into recording studios with capabilities that would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars just 20 years ago. Bedroom producers craft intricate compositions using virtual instruments that convincingly emulate orchestras, synthesizers, and traditional instruments from around the world. A teenager in rural Kansas has access to the same production tools that professionals use in Los Angeles or London studios. This technological accessibility has led to an explosion of musical diversity. Platforms like SoundCloud and Bandcamp allow artists to release music directly to listeners without needing record label approval. YouTube has become a vast repository where musicians share performances, tutorials, and experimental pieces that might never have found audiences through traditional channels. Someone curious about learning an instrument can find thousands of free lessons teaching everything from classical violin technique to how to play traditional Chinese erhu. The boundaries between musical roles have blurred too. Many contemporary musicians are simultaneously composers, performers, recording engineers, and producers. The specialized roles that evolved over centuries of musical tradition have collapsed back together in ways that might remind us of earlier eras, when a traveling musician did everything needed to create and share music. Yet the tools available now are incomparably more sophisticated. Live music has adapted and persisted even as recorded music became ubiquitous. Festivals have grown larger and more numerous, gathering tens of thousands of people to experience music collectively. There seems to be something essential about the shared experience of live performance that recordings cannot fully replicate, no matter how high the audio quality. The ancient human impulse to gather and make music together continues, even in our digital age. Artificial intelligence has begun entering the musical landscape as well. Programs can now compose pieces in the style of batch or generate entirely new melodies based on parameters set by human users. These systems analyze thousands of musical compositions, learning patterns and structures, then creating new works that follow similar principles. The questions this raises about creativity and authorship are still being explored. Can a machine truly create music, or is it simply recombining elements in novel ways? The distinction may matter less than we think. After all, human composers also work within learned frameworks, combining familiar elements in ways that feel fresh. Despite all this technology, the fundamental human relationship with music remains remarkably constant. We still use music to celebrate, to mourn, to express what words cannot capture. Lullabies still soothe restless children much as they have for millennia. Wedding ceremonies around the world still incorporate music to mark the significance of the occasion. Music continues to be present at moments of transition and importance in human life. The neuroscience we explored previously helps explain this continuity. Our brains respond to rhythm and melody in ways shaped by millions of years of evolution. No amount of technological change alters the basic architecture of human consciousness or the way sound waves interact with our auditory system. The latest electronic composition activates the same neural pathways as an ancient drum circle. Looking toward the future, music seems likely to continue evolving in ways we cannot fully predict. Virtual reality concerts where listeners feel physically present with performers might become common. Haptic technology could allow people to feel music physically in new ways, not just through the vibrations we already experience, but through precise tactile sensations coordinated with sound. Brain-computer interfaces might eventually allow musical ideas to flow directly from imagination to realization without any physical instrument as intermediary. Yet for all these possible innovations, the essence of music persists. It remains organized sound that moves us, created by humans for humans. Whether produced by breath blown across a bone flute, fingers pressing piano keys, or computer code executing algorithms, music serves the same fundamental purposes it always has. It helps us feel less alone. It allows us to express and experience emotions safely. It creates order from chaos. It connects us to something larger than ourselves. As you drift towards sleep tonight, you carry within you the entire story of music. The rhythms your heart beats echo the first drums. The melodies you know are built on mathematical relationships the Greeks discovered. The harmonies that move you follow rules refined over centuries. The instruments you have heard represent thousands of years of human ingenuity and craft, and the neurological responses you experience connect you to every human who has ever been moved by organized sound. Music continues, as it always has, as long as there are humans to create and experience it. The story does not end, but simply continues, note by note, into whatever future awaits. As we bring to a close our journey through the story of music, from those first haunting notes on ancient bone flutes to the rich symphonies and electronic sounds of today, we hope these melodies of history have gently carried you through the evening. Thank you for joining us on this peaceful exploration of how humans discovered harmony and why certain sounds touch our souls so deeply. If these calm adventures have brought you comfort, we'd love to have you with us again. Please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below to help other smart sleepers find their way here. And now, as the night deepens and your mind settles, we wish you the sweetest of dreams. Good night, fellow dreamer, and may your sleep be restful and your dreams be kind.